And welcome back, everyone. Um, I had a nice vacation. How about you? I know many of you that watch are also in college, so over my spring break, I decided to just take a break and go on vacation overseas. It was a blast, and I got to meet a lot of good people, got to have a new experience, and get some sun and take a just a bit of a breather and rethink some things and be able to refocus. But here we are. We're back and today I wanted to go through the SEC side of things. As a few weeks ago I released my in-depth Big 10 predictions. I now want to talk about just some thoughts I have on the SEC in general. I want to go through the Big 10 schedules and kind of power rate the schedules on a 1 to 10 scale of difficulty, 1 being the easiest, which the Big 10 has none of those really. There are some like Wisconsin's that are easier than others, but they don't really have a 1. They don't have a MAC level schedule anywhere. And then 10 being the hardest, of which the Big 10 I think has several 10s in their conference. They have some of the toughest schedules in America this year. And also, continuing the way too early previews, probably closing them out after this live show, looking at Texas, Alabama, Georgia, and Michigan. The specific team previews will be back probably sometime in April or May for sure, and then another round of them will be done in the summer, just as I get to do more research and discover more things about these teams. And also, spring camp started for, I know, Ohio State yesterday, and a lot of other places. It's starting this week or maybe has already begun in some pockets. Next week everything might be moving. So that's really exciting to look around college football and see that spring games are just around the corner. Um, you know, these college students, even if it's questionable how many classes they're taking or how much are they student athletes anymore, most of them are still, in class and trying to get their degree. So they're a little over halfway through their winter semester. And it's just interesting to see how they're progressing and how all these things are going to take shape as we enter the spring, the summer, and then fall, which is our favorite time of the year. And then there's some other topics that I want to discuss too. But, of course, make sure if you haven't already to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, comment your thoughts down below. And yeah, we're live Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at noon Eastern time. This was my final break. So every week from here on out, unless I get sick, you're going to be hearing from me Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at noon Eastern time. So make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Let's kick this off by discussing my thoughts on the SEC, some in-depth winter SEC predictions, something that my research told me when peering through anyone from your Georgias and Texases to a new roster in LSU headed by Lane Kiffin to Ryan Silverfield's Arkansas, Will Stein's Kentucky, is that this is a conference that it has still a tremendous amount of talent, has some of the top coaches in the league, but has really suffered a talent and brain drain, I would say, over the past 5 years. A lot of people view 2023 or 2024 as the year the Big Ten really overtook the SEC, at least at the top, and maybe this past year is the season where they overtook the SEC as a conference overall. That is true, but the trends which led to that, I think, started earlier. It started before. I think we could do a whole nother live show on this, and I'll be quick so I don't take your time and we can get to these segments. But I think that the hiring of Urban Meyer by Ohio State and the hiring of Jim Harbaugh by Michigan, and then at Oregon, the hiring of Dan Lanning there really set all of this in motion. And of course, those are over, a large span. It's really over a decade. Meyer was hired by Ohio State in 2012. Harbaugh was hired by Michigan in 15. Lanning was hired by Oregon in 2022. But Jim Harbaugh and Urban Meyer brought a type of mind to the Big Ten that really hadn't resided there, um, outside of, maybe Jim Tressel and Mark D'Antonio, who were elite coaches and great in their own right, but did things differently. Um, you know, Tressel was a D2 guy, an FCS guy with the Youngstown State Penguins. D'Antonio was an Ohio State defensive coordinator, Ohio guy, head coach at Cincinnati, then goes up to Michigan State and totally revives them. Tressel and D'Antonio were wonderful developers of talent and wonderful scouters. They were not exactly known for, at least at the end of their tenures, as something that created a national powerhouse. Now, Jim Harbaugh at Michigan wasn't really known for that either until the very end of his tenure, which happened to be his peak. But Urban Meyer at Ohio State developed a national powerhouse that could recruit and develop and compete with, Alabama in certain given years, and the top of the SEC and Clemson and the top of these Southern programs that just feasted on and hoarded talent. And he set that expectation at Ohio State, where now it's just accustomed for Ohio State to be at that level. Then from Urban Meyer, now to Ryan Day, who is from the Urban Meyer coaching tree, and of course has his own differences, but descends from that tree. Jim Harbaugh, kind of after initially trying to implement what he wanted to do, tried to adapt to the spread and maybe, copy some of the offensive innovation. It didn't work out. He had to make a change at DC from Don Brown to Mike McDonald. So they bring in an NFL defensive system and they revert to more of a game control type of offense. And that coincides with the new meta of college football that also, Georgia in the SEC adopted under Kirby Smart, which is defense and ball control. That won Georgia their 2 titles. But Michigan adapting to that, Ryan Day learning and growing as a head coach and knowing what the expectations are at Ohio State, which were forever changed by Urban Meyer coming there. Like Tressel did a lot to set the foundation to set up Meyer for being able to take Ohio State to that, national powerhouse. But Meyer's the one who kind of solidified that from a recruiting and always having better players than you do standpoint. And then Oregon joins the conference along with USC, UCLA, and Washington. Washington and USC had years of success in the Pac-12, but Oregon, in recent memory in the 21st century, was always the most consistent program. I think Lanning to Oregon is what Meyer was to Ohio State, where Lanning has taken Oregon's prior success, which was plentiful, and he's just permanently ratcheted up the expectations and the abilities and capability of what Oregon can do. I know this is getting long-winded and possibly very boring, but I think it's useful to segue into talking about the SEC because this conference for years has kind of been going the opposite way in my mind, where you have Nick Saban, you have Nick Saban in the NIL era, and those don't totally mesh, and he retires. And before that, a great offensive mind in Gus Malzahn flames out at Auburn. That doesn't work out. You have the lightning in a bottle with Ed Orgeron at LSU in that national title, which was just pure talent, lightning in a bottle, Joe Burrow becoming an NFL sensation. And that fades pretty quickly because that was lightning in a bottle. And the Dan Mullen experiment at Florida just doesn't work out. And what you have is you have these coaches that flame out and they're replaced by similar or inferior coaches. And the NIL and transfer portal era, because the SEC is at the top of the recruiting world and they have by far disproportionately, when NIL is introduced the most talent, people are going to be picking from them and attacking them and rating their rosters more than anyone else because their three deep, the average three deep in the SEC, is much better than the average three deep in the Big Ten, ACC, or Big 12 even combined. And this is even before Texas or Oklahoma joins the SEC. So with the new era coming about, you have a coaching brain drain because Nick Saban gets older. The model that he was able to work changes. He probably didn't think he could do the best that he couldn't do his best job at adapting to that. He couldn't live up to his own standard. So he retires. And the Big Ten, meanwhile, is actually accumulating coaching talent. In 2011, for example, in the Big Ten, Ohio State and Michigan and Penn State, the biggest programs in the Big Ten at the time. And, I mean, heck, you can even include Nebraska, and let's include Michigan State, since Oregon and USC hadn't joined. Those were, like, Wisconsin. Let's bring in Wisconsin and Iowa, too. Kirk Ferentz is still around. You had Brett Bielema at Wisconsin, Mark D'Antonio, Brady Hoke, Luke Fickell, Bo Pelini, and then Joe Paterno before he got fired that year. Those were probably your top 7 coaches in the Big Ten, and maybe I'm forgetting someone like Jerry Kill at Minnesota, but that coaching collection pales, Pat Fitzgerald at Northwestern, that pales in comparison to your current probably top 3rd or top 7, top 8 coaches in the Big Ten. Ryan Day, Kurt Signetti, Dan Lanning, Kyle Whittingham, Jed Fish, Lincoln Riley, Kirk Ferentz, and him and Brett Bielema are still in this conference. And then you have like Bob Chesney, who comes in. Luke Fickell is viewed as one of the worst coaches in the conference, and he did a pretty good job at Cincinnati, is a better coach now than he was at Ohio State in the interim year. And even in the final year of the 14-team Big Ten, before the inclusion of the top 4 Pac-12 programs, or close to that, you had Jim Harbaugh, Ryan Day, James Franklin, Kirk Ferentz, Luke Fickell was in his first year. Matt Rule is probably at least a Bo Pelini level coach for Nebraska or something similar. You had Brett Bielema. I mean, you had Greg Schiano. It was still a much better, at least at the top, coaching group than what the Big Ten had in the early 2010s. Much, much better. And for the SEC, it was kind of going in the opposite direction. So long-winded introduction there, I know, but I think it's important, especially when we've taken a long break here on college football with Sam. It's important to put the SEC and Big Ten rivalry in that perspective, where this battle between them, you see the results on the field, and you see tangible results often long after the trends were already set in motion. So the Big Ten has been catching up to the SEC for years, probably for over 5 years now. And then they had a big breakthrough in the portal and NIL era when that immediately hit the ground running. Even when like Missouri and Texas A&M and some of these other SEC schools were more in the headlines with NIL than the Big Ten schools were, the Big Ten quietly having some money to spend and having much more room on their rosters to bring in talented players than the SEC because they weren't recruiting at the same level, still allowed a flow of talent from the SEC to the Big Ten. That was their breakthrough. And then when the Big Ten got its act together on the NIL front, Michigan got more involved, Ohio State got more involved, and that was really it in the Big Ten. But Penn State was still able to recruit well and retain its roster. Nebraska was trying to get into the NIL space. And then you add Oregon and USC, who are big players in that space. And, I mean, guns a-blazing. Now you have some of the top 5, top 10 spenders, and a lot of them are concentrated in the North. So all that to say, I do think that this is probably going to be the SEC's worst year as a conference since I would have to think about that, honestly. That's actually going to be a future video topic that I want to discuss in a segment. is when was the last time the SEC was this weak as a conference from top down? Their bottom, I don't think, has ever been worse than it is going to be this year or has been. And their top, minus maybe Texas, is probably going to be at its absolute worst. Texas, as an overall caliber of team, might be the best SEC team since Texas had in 2024, or healthy Georgia had in 2024. It could be better than what Georgia had last year. But last year, the SEC had Texas A&M, Alabama, Georgia, Texas, Ole Miss at that top. And all of those teams were guaranteed top 15 teams. There's an argument that most of them were top 10. Is the SEC going to have 5 top 10 teams this coming season, or even 5 top 15 teams? Well, we'll see. We'll see. I would be inclined to say I probably don't think so, but then again, that's just based on very early research. Let's get to these record predictions and thoughts on these specific teams. So we're going to go from worst to best, as we usually do, saving my predicted SEC champion for the end. The runner-up will be the second to last team that we talk about. We'll talk about these coaches. We'll talk about the rosters, the schedules, what I think about them. My way too early SEC predictions for 2026 will include win-loss predictions. We'll discuss key departures, key incoming transfers or returning players, ceilings, floors, most likely records. Just relax, sit back, engage with me in the comments below if you disagree with me about a team's placement or my thoughts on each team, and let me know who your favorite team is. Something I love about college football is that we are all fans of a specific team or a collection of teams, and there's always going to be that tribal excitement. But I also believe a lot of us can have a level head and a clear head, and that combined with the excitement makes banter particularly interesting, and you can always take a variety of perspectives. So with that being said, a lot of these predictions will probably be incorrect, but at College Football with Sam, I think we do a pretty good job of making sure we drive the nail into the 2x4 than hitting our thumb with the hammer. So Kentucky is the first team that I want to discuss, and that is because I view Kentucky as one of the SEC's bottom teams. Not just from where they were last year, where they finished 11th in the SEC, but ultimately, I think entering this year, there isn't a lot of optimism with a very tough schedule that they have, and some of the coordinator hirings, the roster additions. I think on paper, a lot of them were good, but they did also lose some key players. I mean, one thing about Mark Stoops, even though his tenure at Kentucky ended very poorly and he was fired, is that he knew how to build a defensive roster. I mean, when you look at the key 2026 players that they have, outside of offensive line with Colton Price, who's a good transfer from Baylor on the offensive line, Lance Hurd's a high ceiling, kind of shaky lower floor player at offensive tackle, transferred in from Tennessee, and Kentucky paid handsome money for him. Most of the key players I find for Kentucky exist on defense. Kenny Minchey could be a good quarterback. I am intrigued. My interest is piqued by the hiring of Joe Sloan as the offensive coordinator. Was that a him problem at LSU? Was that a Brian Kelly problem? It really feels like that was a disaster with Kelly at LSU and that he never really fit there. But Tavion Gadsden at defensive tackle, Aquise Humphrey-Grace, and Sam Green at edge, and then you have Ty Bryan at safety. It is a defense that does have some players, especially on the defensive front. I remember Deion Walker from a few years back at Kentucky and how good of a defensive tackle he was. And it seems like Kentucky under Stoops had this knack of having some great defensive players and solid defenses. Can Stein keep that with new DC Jay Bateman and then evolve the offense with what he wants to do and Joe Sloan, and bring in a quarterback in Kenny Minchey that really competed for that Notre Dame quarterback gig with CJ Carr, who's a top 10, top 5 quarterback in college football this year? So Minchie clearly can be one of the best quarterbacks in America. Can Stein and Sloan get that out of him, and can they protect him? Can they give him, good receiver talent surrounding him? I know, for example, that name escapes me, but former Oklahoma wide receiver, LSU wide receiver, um, he his name's on the tip of my tongue, but he transferred in, got injured, didn't see much action with Oklahoma in that 2024 season, transferred to LSU, didn't see much action this past season, was pretty good in 2023 for Oklahoma. Nick Anderson, just remembered his name, was about to look up Kentucky's depth chart. If he is able to be healthy and pop off and have a good year and connect with Kenny Minchie, just something as simple as a good wide receiver could really flip Kentucky's schedule, which, look, you get Youngstown State September 5th to kick off the season, but then Alabama at A&M back-to-back games. South Alabama's a bit of a break before traveling to South Carolina, hosting LSU October 10th, playing at Oklahoma, hosting Vanderbilt. That is a murder's row of a schedule. They get a bye on October 31st, but then November 7th they have to play at Tennessee. They host Florida November 14th, play at Missouri November 21st, and because they have a 9-game conference schedule now in the SEC, but Kentucky's has a committed non-conference game against rival Louisville, you have guaranteed 10 Power 4 opponents. And there is an argument that Kentucky is worse than every single Power 4 opponent that they will face in the fall of 2026. When I look at Kentucky this year, I want to provide optimism because I like Will Stein as a coordinator, and I thought he was overhated at Oregon. It's not his fault Indiana depantsed him. Indiana has the nation's best overall coordinator in Bryant Haynes. He's phenomenal. They had an elite OC in Mike Shanahan. Signetti's the best coach in college football and very easily the best scouter and probably the best roster builder. To build that good of a roster and develop it, you can be a great coach or great staff and get totally humiliated by them. They're just a lone star. So I think that Stein got a little bit too much hate for his time at Oregon, and he did a good job developing Moore, making sure Gabriel was put in a good position to succeed. And there were some years where he did, more with less. There were some other years where it felt like he did less with more. But regardless of that, I just don't think that Kentucky is set up on a really good path for success with this schedule. And I hate it. It's probably not realistic. When ESPN's FPI and the win totals release, I'm going to be well below Kentucky's projected win total, but someone has to take the losses in this conference. And that's why I'm predicting Kentucky, along with actually a few other teams that we'll talk about here, to only win probably an SEC game at best, maybe 2, but I'm going to pick them to go winless because someone has to pick up the losses. And in this modern era, it's easier now more than ever to lose cabin pressure and momentum. I do think they will be stronger on defense and on the offensive line than they were last year or than most people expect, but I do have questions about their skill position talent, and they did lose some good defensive backs from last year. It's going to be so hard to, play at A&M, at Oklahoma, at Tennessee, LSU. I just think the expectation here is be competitive, try to reach a bowl game, but if the bottom falls out, with how Stoops ended his tenure, you could probably give this a pass as a rebuild year. My bold prediction is that Kentucky will go winless in SEC play. Mississippi State under Jeff Lebby. That was a team that, look, they impressed me in a lot of ways. I know they had some very painful losses, close losses to Tennessee, to Texas. They went to a bowl at 5-8, and they lost the Duke's Mayo Bowl to Jake Dickert's Wake Forest Demon Deacons. Lebby and Dickert, what they shared in common is they really put together a bunch of vegetable scraps and like apple skins that were just thrown in the compost pile, and they won games with those players. I mean, that is how bad those rosters were. I think Dickert and Lebby had some of the more impressive coaching jobs last year when you factor in what they inherited and where those teams were. Let's just talk briefly about their 2025 schedule. Close loss in overtime to Tennessee, got blown out by A&M, but they were competing with them for a half. Close loss at Florida, close loss at home against Texas, close win over Arkansas, and that Wake Forest game was pretty close. I mean, they had 3 painful losses in SEC play. They were 2-3 in close games, just kind of fell apart at the end of the year with all their injuries. And again, they didn't have that much. So to win an SEC game, to win your 4 non-conference games, including against a good Arizona State team before Sam Leavitt was hurt, was impressive. I do like the addition of Marquise Johnson at wide receiver, returning Anthony Evans III, Isaac Smith at nickel. Kamario Taylor is an intriguing addition at quarterback. They're going to have to make sure they get quarterback and receiver right, as that's an important position in this Jeff Lebby offense. He did a good job with Blake Shapen, who isn't that talented of a quarterback, and they do return Zach Arnett, the defensive coordinator, who was Mike Leach's defensive coordinator. I think that's a really good fit. He did a good job with Leach, and Lebby being a kind of up-tempo offensive mind, I think Arnett knows how to pair a good defense with that style of offense. Again, when you look at this schedule, Louisiana Monroe, non-conference, at Minnesota, September 12th, after the September 5th game against ULM. Why are you playing on the road, out of conference against a Big Ten team? I love out-of-conference games. My eyes will be peeled on this game because I think it will tell us something about these teams and about the SEC and Big Ten, given what Minnesota returns versus what Mississippi State returns. But under the current college football playoff rules, the scheduling meta is play a crazily tough conference schedule, or somewhat tough one, and play no one in the non-con. Why are you playing in the non-conference on the road against a Power 4 opponent? I don't get it. Because that can be the difference between cabin pressure being punctured early or you starting out 2-0 and you feel good entering South Carolina September 19th. Then September 26th, you play Missouri at home. Alabama's at home October 3rd. That will be a huge game. They can sell out for that before entering the bye on October 10th. LSU on the road, Oklahoma at home, Texas on the road, Vanderbilt, Auburn, back-to-back home games. That is a tough 5-game slate from October 17th to November 14th, as shown on the screen. And then they kind of get their annual bye before the Egg Bowl. This time, it's not an actual bye, but it is playing Tennessee Tech. Basically is an automatic win November 21st. And they'll play at Ole Miss Friday, November 27th on Black Friday. I liked what Mississippi State did last year, but again, it's going to be tougher for these lower tier SEC programs to get up off the mat because of the additional conference game, and many of them are still required. I think all of them actually are still required to play a P4 opponent. It's going to be much harder for them to get up off the mat than it was before. And they lost a lot, and this is a very tough schedule. So when I look at Mississippi State right now, I see, again, losing to all your P4 opponents. There's probably going to be a bunch of close losses there, like Minnesota, South Carolina, Missouri, Oklahoma with their style of play, Vandy with all they lose, Auburn with the fact that they have much better coaching staff, but their roster talent's worse. Ole Miss, probably getting worse in a lot of areas. Mississippi State could totally go bowling with this schedule. There's enough opportunities for teams either getting worse or undergoing changes where Mississippi State could steal a few wins. But their roster just isn't what most other SEC rosters are. I mean, it is, when I did my early SEC research, and it's pretty in-depth. It's more in-depth than probably almost everyone's early research other than Phil Steele's. I go through, all the starters. I go through all the returning key players. I go through the two deeps. I look at these depth charts very closely, and I watch the games intently. Mississippi State was at the bottom of my all SEC player list, and I have to compensate for the fact that, typically all conference teams are very selective. To get a better view of all the players I can, I do 6 teams, and they're pretty large teams. Like, we have 2 quarterbacks, 3 running backs, 2 centers, 3 guards, 3 tackles, 5 receivers on just one team, and we have 6 of them. Mississippi State barely had anyone. I think at wide receiver, at running back, where they brought in a pretty good running back there and have some production. They should be good, but outside of that, there isn't a lot to like, I think, about this Mississippi State teams. They're just another one that has to take some of these losses. Arkansas is a program that has had a desire to be competitive and a desire to, I wouldn't call it win the SEC, but be competitive in the SEC and make, the Razorback name mean something. I remember when I was first getting into college football, watching a few of Bobby Petrino's teams when they would play Les Miles' LSU, or when they would play Cam Newton's Auburn, or when they would play Nick Saban's Alabama. And they never won the conference, but they went to New Year's Six Bowls or the Capital One Bowl, which was, the next thing down from a New Year's Six Bowl, and they would win 10 or 11 games, and they would field these really good teams that didn't fit the defensive profile of most of the SEC, but would compensate with that with excellent offense, whether that would be Tyler Wilson at quarterback or the late Ryan Mallett, rest in peace to him. And Sam Pittman at Arkansas sort of had that going on too, where whether it was KJ Jefferson or Taylon Green, they, outside of probably 2023, had like serviceable offenses. Defense was questionable. They won games. And just last year, the defense was so awful and Pittman was under such pressure that the team cratered. They were much better than their record of 2-10, where I think they were 1-6 or 1-7 in one score. No, they didn't win a single one score game. I think they were 0-6 or 0-7 in one score games. And the only team that really blew them out was Notre Dame and then Texas. Those are the only teams that aced them. I love what Ryan Silverfield is doing on the offensive line, bringing in Davion Witherspoon, returning Kobe Branham, who is one of the better guards in the SEC, Jaden Platt. They bring him back along with Quincy Rhodes Jr., where they have appropriate talent on the lines of scrimmage. And I think that KJ Jackson would be a serviceable quarterback, at least for the Razorbacks as well. When you look at the schedule, though, it's like I mentioned earlier, why are you playing Utah in your non-con? Again, I like it. It's going to be a game that I'm going to be paying attention to. But if you're trying to maximize wins and gain momentum, the current meta in CFB says not to do that, because the College Football Playoff Committee is a bunch of idiots and clowns. After the games against North Alabama, September 5th, and Utah, this is the rest of Arkansas' schedule. Georgia at home, Tulsa at home, at Texas A&M, Tennessee at home, Vanderbilt on the road, bye, Missouri at home, Auburn on the road, South Carolina at home, Texas on the road, LSU at home for the Battle of the Golden Boot. And then Ron Roberts as the DC, I think, is an excellent hire. Tim Cranzy is the offensive coordinator. We'll see. But Roberts was an excellent defensive coordinator at Florida, where the Florida defense was the stronger side of the football typically under Billy Napier, especially when Ron Roberts took over as the full-time defensive coordinator. This is another team where I wish I could deliver better news, but I can't do it. The only reason I think they're going to beat South Carolina in November is, just as a little bit of a spoiler alert, I don't think South Carolina is going to be having a fun time, and I think there's going to be some changes made for their program, at least at the conclusion of the 2026 season, if not in the middle of the season. Someone just has to take these losses, and they're not better than Utah. Utah, even with all they lost, is still a better roster than Arkansas, or is comparable, and they get to host that non-con game. Georgia, A&M, Tennessee, Vanderbilt, Missouri, Auburn, Texas, LSU, even South Carolina. They only have 2 games where they have a definitively better roster, and likely the other 10, if not 9 or 8 of those 10, they face opponents with a better roster. and with a better coach as well. I think Silverfield's a very questionable coach based on the fact that he had a ton of resources in the American and never really won or dominated the league. It's a similar story to Billy Napier at Louisiana. Like, yeah, you do well one year, but when you have that much more resources, you should be expected to. They'll be strong on the offensive line. I do like what they have in Quincy Rhodes and at quarterback, but the defense, once again, unless they really nailed all their portal additions and Roberts is a genius, that's probably going to be another rough year on that side of the ball. They just need to be competitive in SEC play. And if you're Arkansas and you think Silverfield's your guy, you got to open up the war chest. I know that you have Calipari in basketball, but you cannot compete or even sniff competitive play in the modern era if you're not willing to spend on your football program. South Carolina's up next, and I'm going to deliver a prediction here so we just get it out of the way. I think Shane Beamer is going to be fired. Middle of the year. Whether during the bye week on October 17th or shortly after that. He will be fired before their final game against Clemson. For sure. I would bet a significant amount of money on that. A significant amount of money on that. It doesn't help that Jacarius Peak, who would have been their best offensive lineman, is going to be out for most of the preseason. Their other tackle, name escapes me, but their offensive line wasn't really that good anyway last year. He's probably out for the year, which is tragic. Be praying for him. Hopefully he can recover. They, once again, it looks like they're going to have a second year of it being Lenoris Sellers, Dylan Stewart, some nice players on defense, but far from a complete unit. And that's going to be it. And you're going to have no offensive line. You're not going to have any receivers. You're not going to have any great coaching. And look, Clayton White's done a good job as the DC there. Kendall Briles has, a on-field good reputation as an OC, but is he great? I don't think so. Not really quite a difference maker there. And look, Brandon Sissy, good cornerback. DQ Smith, good safety. Those are big losses. Brian Thomas Jr., big loss at D end. Vendravius Jacobs transferred out to Miami. So you are getting, pushed down. You're getting shoved down as a program. You're not a top SEC program. Beamer, even with good recruiting, has failed to bring you to that level. And some of his better players that he's brought in, like Lenoris Sellers, definitively better in 2024 than he was in 2025. Hasn't looked like he's developed much at all. And Nick Harbor was better as a D-end, wanted to be a receiver. South Carolina acquiesced to that need, and all he is a deep threat. He's a one-trick pony. They've not done a good job at developing. They have not done a good job setting their program up for long-term success. And now they look, Georgia, Alabama, Texas, obviously ahead of them. It's safe to say that after it looked like South Carolina was ahead of Oklahoma in 2024, Oklahoma has passed them and is a better program. LSU is ahead of them. Even with all their calamities and disaster last year, they still beat South Carolina by double digits last year. Florida has a better roster, a freakier roster. Tennessee is making appropriate program moves and is better than them. Vanderbilt had a better team last year and dominated them. I know Sellers got injured in that game, but even if he were healthy, Vanderbilt wins that game. And Beamer is just so far behind to a point where it's like Will Muschamp, South Carolina. You're no different than that. So I think that he is going to be fired. And if I'm wrong, it will be because Sellers is so good that the inadequacies on the rest of the offense don't matter. And he's a Walmart Cam Newton, or turns into something like that, or is something like Trinidad Chambliss. And on top of that, some of the defensive additions that they have made, Tamiwa Duriage from Illinois, for example, at defensive tackle, they pan out. But it really does seem like current Seattle Seahawks safety, nickel, corner, linebacker, you can basically play any position in the backfield. It really does look like Nick Emanwori and Lenoris Sellers really carried that team in 2024 along with Dylan Stewart and some other players. It does look like that. And outside of just a few talented players, which if you recruit at a high enough level, you'll hit on some of those guys, there isn't much anything else going on there. So I think South Carolina, they're more talented than Mississippi State and Kentucky. So I think they'll beat those teams on the schedule along with Kent State and Towson. So they'll exit September with a 3-1 or 4-1 record. But this is their SEC slate. At Alabama, Kentucky, at Florida, bye, Tennessee, at Oklahoma, Texas A&M, at Arkansas, Georgia, and then at Clemson. And then I'm not going to forget about Mississippi State, which starts all of that off. They should be strong at quarterback and the defensive line and parts of the secondary too. But where are the skill position players I care about? Where are the consistent ones? What about the offensive line, which has never been a strength? It's always been a weakness under Shane Beamer. And again, someone has to take these losses. Someone does, especially when the SEC returns a lot of key players and has a lot of teams that return high levels of production and quality starters at the top. I think Shane Beamer is fired before rivalry week. That is my bold prediction for the South Carolina Gamecocks, because I think in order to keep his job, he has to win at least 6 games, if not 7. And at this point, you got to beat Clemson. You got to beat your Arkansas. You got to beat your Vanderbilts. You got to beat even your Floridas who've been down. I mean, you have been here now going on 5 years. You've been here for a while. It's actually, no, it's not 5. You're going on 6 years as the head coach of South Carolina. And your record is 33-30, and you have 2 losing seasons, and you had your worst season in SEC play last year with all of your players. So it's do or die time for Shane Beamer, and I think professionally his career at South Carolina is going to die. Vanderbilt is a team that loses a tremendous amount of talent. Diego Pavia, Eli Stowers, Jordan White, Corday Seednor, Langston Patterson. But I think they did a good job in the transfer portal. Getting Lyndon Cooper, a center from Pittsburgh, returning Cedric Alexander, Junior Sherrill, a good interior defensive line, cornerback Jordan Matthews, and then Steve Gregory and Tim Beck return. So the staff is kept intact. 10-3 at Vanderbilt is coach of the year caliber stuff. The only reason why Clark Lee shouldn't have been unanimous coach of the year last year is that Curt Cignetti went 16-0, won the national title, beat Dan Lanning like Kirby Smart did when Lanning was in year 1 once, and then the other time he beat him was by 10 points, and just kind of owned the Big Ten in college football last year in scouting, game management, in assessing what he needed to do to win it all, and doing it with less than almost everyone else he was competing with and beating en route to going 16-0. Vanderbilt did something similar. I mean, they sure had some losses with a weaker schedule to Alabama, to Texas, lost to Iowa in the bowl game, had flirtations with disaster against Auburn, and with hindsight, you could probably say with LSU with how poor they were. But they crushed South Carolina. They were undefeated in the non-con. They beat LSU. They beat Missouri. They did win a close game against Auburn. They crushed Kentucky and then dominated Tennessee on the road, which caused Tennessee to fire Tim Banks, get rid of their strength and conditioning coach, and probably was a come-to-Jesus moment for Josh Heupel, who has seemingly restructured his program and used the transfer portal more after that humiliating loss. 10-3, 7th in the SEC. They lost the ReliaQuest Bowl to an Iowa team that played Indiana, Oregon, and USC, and Iowa State, all teams they lost to that all had 8 wins or more, and 2 of them were semifinalists. That Iowa team could have been top 10 if different things broke, and I think was certainly a top 15, at worst, top 20 team to end the year, much like Vanderbilt was. There's no shame in losing to that Iowa team. Much like Iowa, they do lose a lot, but they also bring back some key players. And I think that Clark Lee and his staff are great enough and adaptive enough and flexible enough to where even though they're going to have a true freshman starting quarterback in Jared Curtis, their system, their way of doing things is going to withstand the test of time. It will not dominate like it did last year. It will not be as frustrating to deal with last year. This is an obvious rebuild year, I think. But I look at this schedule. Austin Peay, Delaware, NC State at home, at Auburn, at Georgia, Ole Miss at home, Arkansas at home, Kentucky on the road, then off the bye, at Mississippi State, Alabama, at Florida, Tennessee. And I think this is a schedule that, with the talent and coaching Vanderbilt has, they're going to go bowling. Maybe they could win 7 games, maybe even win 8 games. They could also lose 7 games or lose 8 games and miss a bowl game. But I'm going to take the median approach there. I think ceiling of 8-4, floor of 4-8. I have enough faith in this staff and roster to where they'll be good enough on the lines of scrimmage, they'll have good enough skill position players, and Curtis is a talented enough quarterback as a freshman where they'll be able to win some games. They'll be able to maybe give some of the better teams they play a scare, and they'll beat the lower level teams. So even with Georgia, Ole Miss, Florida, and Tennessee on the schedule, which is easier than some SEC schedules actually, that combined with low expectations, I think just making a bowl game will make Vanderbilt fans happy, and a high-level staff will help Clark Lee and this regime continue to build momentum. And I don't think they'll lose a game by more than 2 scores because they avoid Texas, who I think by far has the best roster in the SEC. They also avoid LSU, who, with Lane Kiffin's offense and some of the players they have in defense, is going to be able to blow some teams out. All the top teams they play, which would probably be Georgia, Florida, Alabama, and Tennessee, they're either not going to have the talent to blow you out, or their style of play means a blowout looks like a 2 or 3 score win. So I don't think they'll lose a game by more than 2 scores. In Vanderbilt's style of play and kind of triple option offense, which was built for Pavia, but it's also, still Tim Beck and Jerry Kill's system. I imagine that Vanderbilt will find a way to stay in a lot of these games and do a good job scheming and preparing for their opponents. Auburn's an interesting case. I love the Alex Golesh hire. I loved his staff hires. I love that he retained DJ Durkin. What I don't love is the fact that they lost a lot of talent, a lot of recruited talent by Hugh Freeze that I think with Golesh development would have been served well. But they left Simmons for Texas Tech, Singleton for Florida, Coleman for Texas, Keldrick Falk went to the NFL, Kean Lee went to Tennessee, was pursued by Ohio State. Coleman was pursued by USC and Texas Tech. I imagine Singleton had other offers too. They lost a lot of players that would have started if they came back. And I think when you look at a new regime, especially in this era where expectations are higher than ever because of what Cignetti did and because there's this illusion that with the portal and NIL, rebuilds don't exist anymore, the best way for a coach to start off fast and have success is for you to combine a good incoming staff with incoming players they had at the prior regime that fit the requirements to win against the schedule they're going to face, and you keep some good players from the older roster. Indiana did this under Cignetti. They brought in a ton of JMU players. They brought in a good quarterback, since they didn't view their quarterback as good enough to follow them to Indiana to win at a high level there. And they retained some good players like Carter Smith on the offensive line, or their guards, and some other players. On defense, for example, they brought back some guys that were serviceable. I mean, even Lewis Moore, who transferred from Indiana to Ole Miss, then transferred back to Indiana in 2025. With Auburn, you could have that going on, but they lost a lot of their good players, and I don't know. USF, what's tricky about them is they were top 25 in FPI last year, and they did a good job beating Florida and crushing Boise State and earning actually several ranked wins at the time they played those teams. They also dominated North Texas in the regular season, just did a good job overall in the American. They were the best team in the American, outside of maybe Tulane. My question with Auburn is, does that success, do all of those players translate to the SEC? Because if they do, then with how much roster continuity they have and the fact that they have a great DC in DJ Durkin, and Golesh is going to be running that, Tennessee offensive system with some greater talent, then Auburn could compete for the SEC this year. If all of that translates, if they have the same type of translation from the USF roster to the Auburn roster, and those USF players can compete with SEC players and in some cases be better than them at Auburn, then you're looking at what Curt Cignetti had in year one. And since there isn't going to be a 2024 Ohio State to stop you, you might even win the SEC. You might win a playoff game or two. There's also the idea, though, that it's just going to be a bunch of American players, like American conference players, in the SEC, and that could end very badly. I'm kind of taking the median average approach to that. Maybe I'm a little bit lower. I'm lower on Auburn and lower on their team than I would have liked, given how much I admire Golesh and his staff. I think that was the best hire in terms of long-term of the 2025 through 2026 coaching carousel. Short-term, I think it's Kyle Whittingham at Michigan. Long-term, I would probably go with Golesh, or would have gone with Golesh when it happened. But the roster, I think, is a year or two or even three away, unless a lot of those USF players are as good as or better than the SEC players they will be facing on Saturday. So Auburn, I think they'll beat Baylor, Southern Miss, lose to Florida at home in a close game, beat Vanderbilt at home, lose to Tennessee. Off the bye, playing at Georgia, hosting LSU, and playing at Ole Miss is just a murder's row of three games. So I have Auburn dropping all of those. I do think they'll beat Arkansas, Mississippi State on the road, and then Samford before dropping their final game of the year at Alabama. Making a bowl game in year one after Freeze failed to do it in 2 out of his 3 years, I think would be considered a success, especially with how much talent left the door and the fact that Auburn probably has a tougher schedule this year than they did last year. I think Auburn, in a bold prediction for them, will have a worse power rating than they did last year, but they will be a better team, if that makes sense. Like, their ceiling, their potential to pop off, and talent won't be as good, but they will do a better job of winning games because they will have a better organization and better leader on the sidelines. So I have Auburn going 6-6, finishing 11th in the SEC. Pretty high ceiling. If I had to go back and change their ceiling, I'd probably change it to 10-2, or maybe even higher than that, because there's just so much variance with the incoming roster they have. Missouri with Eli Drinkwitz is another curious case where a lot of these teams at the top, like Georgia, Texas, I think we all pretty much know those are definite top 3 teams in the SEC. Could one of them have a Penn State Clemson level collapse? I mean, sure. But I think that with hindsight, there were unique things that went into those two teams collapsing, and a lot of it had to do with the leaders they had. And I don't think that Sark or Smart are nearly as bad of head coaches as Dabo Swinney or James Franklin are right now. For Missouri and Drinkwitz, they've often been innovators, where they've never had high expectations, and yet Drinkwitz has had 2 double-digit winning seasons with Missouri. Last year they went 8-5 with a litany of injuries, so that was one of their down years, and they still won 8 games. And with a healthy Pribula, you got to think maybe they beat Vanderbilt, or maybe they beat Oklahoma, or something along those lines. I think Drinkwitz is a good coach. and I think he's done a good job. He's done more with less. Bringing back Ahmad Hardy and Jamal Roberts, if they get offensive line right, and I like the three, Curtis Piegler at guard, and then Caden Green and Josh Atkins at tackle, if they can get the center and other guard correct with that rushing attack and with Simmons' mobility and how he had some issues at Ole Miss, but we also discovered how elite Chambliss is, they could have one of the best offenses with offensive coordinator Chip Lindsey, who had success at Auburn, success at North Carolina, did well at Michigan in terms of efficiency metrics, but in big games had some struggles. It's unknown whether or not that was actually him running the offense or Sharon Moore. I kind of feel like it was the latter, and he was put in a bad position. And they got Caden, they got, not Caden Green, but at wide receiver, Caden Lee. Mixed those up there. Caden Lee. So another Caden. They have two Cadens who are really incredible. Caden Lee was a great wide receiver at Ole Miss. Green has been there for years and has been a great college player at offensive tackle. My question for Missouri is the defense. They lose to Reno Pride, Jalen Catalon, Damon Wilson transfers to Miami. Quarterback and receiver, I think they're going to do a pretty good job reloading at. Same with the offense in general. My question is what happens with Corey Batoon's unit, the defense. If they're able to retool there after losing one of every single position. Out of all 11 positions, they lost at least one, if not two players from there. They lost a lot of production on that side of the ball. If they can reload there or mostly retool, then I think even with a very tough schedule, Arkansas Pine Bluff, at Kansas, Troy, at Mississippi State September 26th, Florida October 3rd, A&M October 10th, at Ole Miss October 17th, then off the October 24th bye at Arkansas, Texas, at Georgia, Kentucky, and Oklahoma, they could do well against what is a very tough schedule. And a schedule that has a lot of top 15, top 10 teams, and even some trickier games like Mississippi State and Kansas and Arkansas, all teams that should be wildly inferior to Missouri, but are on the road and have good enough players and or coaches at certain positions to give Missouri issues. This is a high variance team, more so than probably any other team we've talked about, except for maybe Auburn. I have faith in Drinkwitz to at least get Missouri to a bowl game. I think much like last year, the schedule is easy to start out. It is a very slow incline, but the ramp gets steep pretty quickly. So they are going to have to hit the ground running, stay healthy, and hope that, between Florida, A&M, and Ole Miss, I have them losing all three because I think they have better rosters. Hope that your roster and staff are good enough to win at least one of those. Enter the bye week with 5 wins, and with Arkansas and Kentucky on that schedule, you'll at least get 6 or 7 wins, and maybe with Texas or Oklahoma at home, you could pull off one of those upsets. This is a schedule primed with opportunity. I love what Missouri has in the middle of the field. Good D tackles, good linebackers, good lines of scrimmage and running backs. The question I have is perimeter play. That's the question I have. Overall talent, depth, and perimeter play. I think if they rebuild and are competitive, Missouri fans will be fairly happy. My bold prediction is that they do a good job of reloading on defense, actually. And I think that gives room for them to entertain 9-3 or even 10-2 with what would be a very tough schedule. They could also bottom out, though, and miss a bowl game with how many road games they play, where they're at, and then the fact you have to play Oklahoma, Texas, and Georgia, who arguably could be your top 3 SEC teams. Alabama, getting to the Crimson Tide next. This is going to be a rebuild. It's going to be a rebuild. When you lose the amount of talent you do, Ty Simpson, Jeremy Bernard, Isaiah Horton, Tim Keenan, Deontay Lawson. This isn't even talking about players like Caden Proctor, James Smith, Qua Russaw, Justin Jefferson. Players who were just good at best, average or even bad at the very worst, but they had talent and were bodies. Just losing them as depth is going to hurt. without some serious changes in the philosophy of Alabama, where last year you could tell they wanted to run the ball, much like Ohio State, but even more so than Ohio State because they didn't have a Bo Jackson and their offensive line was even worse coached and worse developed. They couldn't do it, and it really hampered their offense and it pigeonholed them. And they weren't that great at pass blocking either. They weren't. I mean, the offense at the end of the year was an absolute unmitigated disaster because it was one-dimensional, it could be put in a hole, and the defense is what won Alabama that Oklahoma game. The defense is the only reason why Indiana or Georgia didn't score a combined 100 or 120 points. The defense is what was able to, like, keep them in the Oklahoma game even with all their turnovers and mistakes. It was really what won them the game against Georgia that first time around. Like, the defense for Alabama after that week one was a very good unit. The offense just got figured out towards the end of the year. I still respect DeBoer and Grubb as offensive minds. I think DeBoer is a top 10 coach at the worst, top 5 at the best. And I think Kane Womack is a respected defensive coordinator. This is the best staff that DeBoer has ever had at Alabama. The problem is this is also his worst roster. Sure, yeah, Keelan Russell's probably a better thrower of the football than Jalen Milroe. He probably has a higher ceiling than Ty Simpson. However, huge however, the further you get from the Nick Saban era of dominant recruiting, of just finding these freaks and always getting them on campus, and the more the transfer portal wears at your roster, and Alabama did not have a good portal class, the worse your roster gets. So while your staff, using this hand, I forget that, obviously this is mirrored. As your staff slowly gets better, that is going to actually be pulled down by the fact that, again, other hand, your roster is decreasing, is regressing at a faster, quicker rate than your coaching staff is improving. This has been the case for Alabama over the last 3 years. The roster has been regressing at a faster rate than the coaching staff has improved. It's why this past year, Alabama was able to win a playoff game and get to the SEC title game and win some close games and not look as totally disheveled as they did in 2024. But they also never showed the potency that they did in 2024, say, against Georgia in that first game. Where in that first half, it looked like, wow, that might be the best team in the country. Like that might be the number one team. That team might even be better than Ohio State, and they certainly look better than Georgia in that first half. And last year's Alabama never showed that. What this year's Alabama team is going to have to do, Bray Hubbard, Keon Sabb, Zabian Brown, Red Morgan, thankfully that entire secondary pretty much returns. Then you have a good D tackle in London Simmons, who was a freshman last year who played. You return Yanze Pierre at D end. They bring back Latsier Brooks at receiver, who was good, and hopefully Ryan Williams in his third year can have a bit of a bounce back after a sophomore slump. And then Clem, I really like their offensive line coach. I love their offensive line coach. They are going to have to figure out ways to win close games that they did last year while also developing their younger players throughout the year so that they're not one-dimensional. And so that if they do reach the playoffs, they can be competitive, or so that in November, when things are being settled, they can win against LSU on the road or beat Vanderbilt on the road. Or in the middle of the year, they can beat one of Georgia at home and Tennessee on the road. And then A&M after that Tennessee game, they can beat preferably two of those teams. This schedule, East Carolina, Kentucky, Florida State, South Carolina, Kentucky's on the road, Mississippi State after South Carolina, Georgia at Tennessee, A&M at LSU, at Vanderbilt, Chattanooga, and Auburn is, I think, one of the easier schedules in the SEC. And that aligns well with Alabama having an obvious rebuild year. for their program. I might change this. Right now, I do have them going 8-4, 5-4. They'll probably be more of a 9-3 caliber team. I just don't trust them on the road against LSU or Tennessee with how those teams are built and the coaches they have. And I don't trust them against Kirby Smart in Georgia, who I think has a better roster, has a better staff, finally figured out how to get DeBoer last year, and he got him badly. And then A&M might have the best defense in the SEC. And look, as much as I don't like A&M's situation, we'll talk about them shortly, they at least showed they could have a competent rushing attack last year, and they really nailed the portal on defense in a way that I don't think Alabama did. Alabama should improve if Russell pans out in the passing offense. They probably should improve in the rushing attack because I don't think you can get worse there. But their losses at linebacker, some of the losses of depth on the defensive line, and their losses at receiver are pretty bad. And I do think that it will take time, probably a whole year, for Russell to get acclimated. We'll see about that, though. Because of the roster, this is another, high variance team. Not as high variance as Auburn or Missouri because the built-in talent gives them a high floor. But this team could win the national title if everything goes correctly. They could also go 7-5, and DeBoer could be fired, or he could be on the hot seat entering 2027. I do think for the first time since 2007, they win fewer than 9 regular season games. They went 9-3 in 2024, and in 2010, they also lost 3 games in the regular season plus conference championship game last year. I think they lose 4 regular season games this year and ultimately finish in the middle of the SEC. For Ole Miss, they return Trinidad Chambliss. The NCAA is trying to challenge that. I do think they'll lose, and I think it's awfully petty that they're trying to challenge that. Ole Miss also brings back Kawan Lacey, who him or Ahmad Hardy are the best running backs in college football. Deuce Alexander returns. Will Eccles at defensive tackle comes back, and same with Cam Franklin at defensive end. Ole Miss has a collection of good players. I think this is a roster in the SEC that is upper middle of the pack, and with Chambliss and Lacey, if John David Baker, Patrick Toney, and Pete Golding do a good job at developing their players and putting them in the best position to win, if they can keep what Kiffin had in his system and keep that engine running, this could be a really good team in 2026 for sure. Losing Winston Watkins and Caden Lee sucks, and then TJ Daugherty and Chris Graves Jr. depart. They did lose a lot of transfers, but they also brought in a lot of transfers. I didn't list any of those transfers, by the way, because they did bring back a lot of good players on their own. But an example of a transfer they did bring in who is going to be impactful, I think you got to look at Blake Purchase from Oregon. I also think that you have to look at Luke Farrelly, who originally went to Clemson, then went to Ole Miss, and there was that whole Dabo Swinney story about that. They bring in Jay Crawford at cornerback, and then they return Lucas Carniero, their excellent kicker, who basically won them that game against Georgia and is a future NFL kicker. So good special teams, great quarterback, running back. With the system they have, they don't really have to have a great offensive line to succeed. The defensive line, I think, on paper is going to be better this year than it was last year. And TJ Daugherty wasn't a highly graded linebacker anyway, just kind of a good college player, but not much more. The more I talk about it live, the more I do like Ole Miss and what they have to offer. They were a good team last year. They were not nearly as loaded as they were in 2024, but they were much better coached. I think they had better leadership, and they were more consistent, and they had more of a chip on their shoulder than that 2024 team did, and that carried them further even though they weren't as talented. Also, Trinidad Chambliss, better college quarterback than Jackson Dart. That probably had something to do with the success that they had, and they had a better running back group. That was the key difference, is that they could run the football at a more consistent level last year than in 2024, and that, along with having more like more great college quarterback play, like X factor wow moments at the quarterback position help them win some close games and also help them win against Georgia in that Sugar Bowl, which was really, the ultimate, Trinidad Chambliss coming out party game where you finally realized how elite and how good of a player he is. I do think Ole Miss should expect some regression. I don't think there should be very high expectations for this team. And the reason I say that is because when you lose the amount of talent you do and lose that type of, coaching staff, and then your schedule's harder, Louisville, Charlotte, LSU, at Florida, at Vanderbilt, Missouri, at Texas, Auburn, Georgia, at Oklahoma, Wofford, and Mississippi State. Look, it's gonna be hard. I mean, I have them beating LSU and Lane Kiffin, but then you got to travel at Florida. Are you going to win back-to-back games against those two rosters? Are you going to beat one of Texas, Georgia, or Oklahoma? They face the top four teams in the SEC: LSU, Texas, Georgia, and Oklahoma, and two of them are on the road. And then outside of that, Missouri and Florida should be top 25 power rated teams, probably. Louisville could be too. So it's a very tough schedule. And the defense last year was just a good unit at times. Other times it was straight up bad. And that combined with an offense that should be similar to last year, but we just don't know until we see it because of the changes, gives me some caution. So I do think Ole Miss, they're still going to be a good team. They're going to be competitive. They're going to be a pain in the butt for anyone to play. But I have them going 8-4, 5-4. They'll place 8th in the SEC. And entering that game against Georgia, I do think they will be in the college football playoff conversation. Those home games against LSU and Georgia are going to determine a lot. And between Florida and Oklahoma, because I'm very skeptical of seeing them beating Texas, but maybe they could with Chambliss and his receivers against Muschamp and a defense that doesn't give their secondary a bunch of help, will play a bunch of man and is questionable at safety. Ole Miss could lose to almost anyone they play in the SEC this year, but they could also beat almost everyone. I'm confused. So I'm placing them at 8-4, 5-4. We'll get back to you guys in the spring with more thoughts on Ole Miss for sure. Texas A&M. Talk about a team that overachieved in 2025, and I think now is going to have to reset expectations for the future. When I look at how much they lost, their entire offensive line, their receivers outside of Mario Craver, much of their defensive front, so Cassius Howell, for example, Scooby Williams, Tareen York. He did a great job in the portal on defense, bringing in Anto Saka from Northwestern, Tawfiq Bayard at safety. And look, Mario Craver's a good receiver. Reed, I think, is who he is at quarterback. If he takes the next step, A&M could reload. If he does not, it could be very rough. With the departure of Colin Klein, the OC, much of the offensive line, and that was one of the better offensive lines in college football, and just changes at other positions. You lose one of your better running backs. Casey Conception is off to the draft, and he was one of their best receivers last year. And I'm curious. I think that they did very good in the portal. They did well. I like Elko as a coach, but what of the internal staff promotions? What of a schedule that is much tougher than last year's, where, think about it, last year their biggest games were Notre Dame on the road and Texas on the road. They didn't really play anyone else worth a lick. They beat Notre Dame by a point, and Texas beat them by 10 points, double digits. And that was a Texas team that wasn't even top 10 in final power rankings per FPI. And Notre Dame, at the time they played them, probably wasn't even a top 10 team. And at the end of the year, they were like a fringe top 5, definitely top 10 caliber team. They played a very easy schedule, won some close games, and then split their two big games. And then in the postseason, lost to Miami at home in a hurricane, essentially. This schedule features a home game against Missouri State September 5th, and then they host Arizona State, Kentucky, play at LSU, host Arkansas, play at Missouri, get a weird game middle of the year against the Citadel October 17th before playing at Alabama October 24th. After a bye, they play South Carolina, Tennessee, at Oklahoma, and Texas Friday, November 27th in November. So, yeah, it's a tougher schedule. Last year, they didn't play Tennessee. They didn't play Oklahoma. They didn't play Alabama. They played LSU, but a much inferior LSU roster compared to what LSU has this year. And while Arizona State is not Notre Dame, Texas A&M this year is also not going to be Texas A&M of last year. On paper, there should be quite a bit of a regression. The defense should improve by a little bit. Offense should regress, should even implode by quite a lot, in my opinion. That's what I see out of Texas A&M. You know, a good team last year was flirting with being great, but they were never really elite. This year, you're going to see a bit of coming back down to earth. They'll be strong on defense. I do believe that this could be the SEC's best defense. If I look at my all SEC teams and factor in that Elko's a good defensive mind, they have... It's probably them, Florida, and South Carolina that have the best defensive end groups in the SEC. Honorable mention to Texas. They have a pretty good linebacker group. It's not as good as Oklahoma's, Georgia's, or Tennessee's, but it's up there with Texas, where Texas is a lot of upside at linebacker, not a bunch of depth. They probably have the best safety group in the SEC outside of maybe Alabama. Their biggest question, I think, is corner. It's really their biggest question on defense. And with the front they have, they should be able to do a good job against the run, get pressure on the quarterback. It should be Elko's best defense at Texas A&M. The problem I see is how much they lost in the offensive line, tight end, and running back. And also keeping in mind that Marcel Reed is very much a system quarterback. I do think they lose in upset fashion to Arizona State at home, and I kind of think LSU blows them out or rosters them in week 4. I believe strongly that Elko is a good coach and they have good players. And due to that, even though they're very young and lose a lot of production offensively, eventually they're going to pick up steam. And I think by the end of the year, A&M is going to be a much better team than they were in the month of September. I have them going 8-4, 6-3, and placing 7th in the SEC. Speaking of LSU, here we go. The Tigers fired Brian Kelly. That was one of our best predictions in the preseason, is that Brian Kelly would be fired in the middle of the year. You can find it on record in some of my SEC or top 25 prediction videos last year. We said that Brian Kelly was likely going to be fired at LSU after 2025. I went a little bit bold and said it would happen in the middle of the year. And it did, after A&M completely dominated them in Tiger Stadium. They play A&M in Tiger Stadium again September 26th after a non-conference slate of Clemson, Louisiana Tech, and opening up the year playing at Ole Miss September 19th. McNeese comes to town October 3rd. They play at Kentucky, host Mississippi State, play at Auburn. Off the bye, they play Alabama, Texas, at Tennessee, and at Arkansas. You know, it's like most SEC schedules, it's tough. But look at that November slate. Alabama at home, Texas at home, Tennessee on the road. It's a tough 3-game slate. Outside of that, though, the schedule looks, fairly manageable. Almost all of their great players are going to be transfers. Levitt at quarterback, Trey Brown, their best receiver, I think, transfer. Jordan Seaton, their best offensive lineman, transfer. Princewell and Malin, transfer at defensive end. DJ Pickett, much of LSU secondary, so Deshaun Spears, PJ Woodland, DJ Pickett, all of them were recruits at LSU, by the way. Kelly did a really good job recruiting that defensive back group. They had a really impressive defensive backfield last year, a lot of young players. That is what gives me optimism here, is that Kiffin knows offense. He can quickly implement his system in week 1, in year 1, and month 1, whatever. Will it be his ideal system? I don't know. I don't. I mean, I actually kind of have a difficult time seeing it as good as his Ole Miss systems the past 2 years, but it could be close, and they'll have a level of talent defensively that, at least in the defensive backfield, will be closer to what Ole Miss had in 2024 than what they had in 2025. The difference between a top 10 or top 5 defense versus a defense that was just top 50. It's a pretty big difference there. They also bring back Whit Weeks, TJ Daugherty transfers in. They bring in Jordan Ross at defensive end as well, and Stephalon Green from Clemson at defensive tackle. And they retained Blake Baker at DC, and Charlie Weiss Jr. followed Lane Kiffin from Ole Miss. Safe to say this team is going to be much better than it was last year. I am on record for saying I'm skeptical of whether or not Lane Kiffin succeeds at LSU. That has nothing to do with the fact that I think Lane Kiffin is a bad coach or that this roster for LSU is bad. They're both very good. But LSU definitely has the expectations long-term of being a dynasty. And I just, like, combining modern era with Kiffin's antics, and his antics really being he doesn't care about defense. He does, but he also doesn't. Gives me skepticism about him long-term. Short-term, I'm thinking that 9-3 or 10-2 is what this team is going to end up being. I sided with 9-3 because I do think there are enough holes, specifically on the lines of scrimmage, and enough questions about Leavitt's status to where you just never know. But I really do see high ceiling, high floor for this team given the schedule. They're definitely going to be competing for the college football playoff in November. I do think LSU fans, and you LSU fans could correct me if I'm wrong, I get the suspicion that you would be frustrated if you didn't make the college football playoff. There'd be a bit of disappointment, but I also get the feeling that depending on how these teams that you lose to look, that there could also be a year one grace period. Maybe I'm wrong there. I think definitely year two and from there is win the SEC, reach the playoff, win playoff games, compete for a national title, and in one of those years you better win a national title. I don't quite know what the expectations are year one beyond competing for the playoffs, because Kelly, let's be honest, never really did that for the 4-team playoff, and he didn't do that last year or in 2024 for the 12-team playoff either. Like, they were well out of the conversation by early November. My bold prediction is that LSU starts off 8-1, but finishes 9-3. I think that Ole Miss could be a better version of what Kiffin wants LSU to be early on. And with that being at home, I think that could be for Ole Miss. I think that could be a game where just Chambliss being better than Leavitt and Golding and Kiffin knowing each other, just like a lot of familiarity there between the staffs. So maybe it distills down to the players, and I do think Ole Miss just has better offensive players than LSU does at running back, quarterback, and I think the offensive lines are pretty comparable. And Ole Miss will have an inferior defense, but they could have a better defensive line, so that could just make some things interesting. And in that final 3-game stretch, excluding Arkansas at the end, Alabama and Texas at home, Tennessee on the road, that's tough. I think LSU's a better roster than Alabama, and it's off a bye, so I'd expect them to win that game. Texas is probably better at every position except for corner, and they have a better coach and a better staff. So I do not expect LSU to win that game. And then Tennessee on the road, I think by then Knowles' defense will set in a bit. And by then, Faison Brandon should also set in for Tennessee, or whoever their starting quarterback is. I think Tennessee, much like A&M, is going to be one of these teams that is better at the end of the year than at the beginning. When I look at Tennessee's roster, I had LSU 9-3, 6-3, top third of the SEC, definitely a playoff contender. Tennessee loses Brazel to the NFL. Same with Kitzelman. They lost a lot on defense, but they also brought in good transfers on defense, and you have to remember that the problem with them defensively was coaching last year. They did not lack talent. They, I think, lacked coaching. When I look at Heupel and his program, I've thought that they've missed elite defense and they've missed being able to play complementary football, where the one year they had a good defense and it wasn't as good as the metrics suggested, but it was good in 2024. Their offense was disheveled and couldn't, they couldn't fit. They couldn't put a puzzle together. It was a really convoluted, bad offense, to say the least, especially when you consider how successful Heupel's system is. Just look at last year. Joey Aguilar's not a good quarterback, and he put up good numbers, and Tennessee's offense was ridiculously good at efficiency metrics. You don't need much to have a good offense statistically with Heupel's system. They do lose that experience, and it's going to be up to one of the quarterbacks in that Tennessee room to win the job and to take a step up. I do think that will be Faison Brandon. Mike Matthews, Braylon Staley make up a great wide receiver duo, and then they also bring in Chaz Coleman, Amari Campbell, DeJuan Lane, some Penn State transfers who followed Jim Knowles from Penn State to Tennessee. Knowles traditionally takes more than a year to get things running. I do not think that his defense will be fantastic in year one, but I do think it will be better than the dumpster fire that was last year. I mean, think of his time at Ohio State, where in year one, the defense was a top 25 unit, and that angered a lot of Buckeye fans because of how it imploded at the end of the year. But it was a much better defense analytically, statistically, and physically than the 2021 defense was. The 2021 defense just never faced offenses like 2022 Michigan or 2022 Georgia. They never faced anything like that. So they were a bit inflated by, a fairly weaker schedule they played, and Ohio State having a massive talent edge over everyone they faced except for Michigan. I think you're going to see something similar, where maybe in some of these big games, maybe against LSU, definitely against Texas, maybe elsewhere if, say, Alabama or A&M totally pop off offensively on their schedule. You could see that. But I do believe that they are going to be much better on the defensive side of the ball, just not top 10, not top 15, probably top 25 or top 20. What's going to determine how high Tennessee can reach on top of how big the improvement is defensively is what does quarterback look like. This should be a better Tennessee offensive line than they've usually had. Receiver should be good. Running back should be set. They've done a good job recruiting, done a good job of using the portal. When I look at Tennessee's schedule, Furman at Georgia Tech, Kennesaw State, Texas, Auburn, Arkansas, Alabama, at South Carolina, Kentucky, at Texas A&M, LSU, and Vanderbilt. Much like LSU, who we just talked about, it is a workable schedule, even though it is tough. I like their defensive backfield, and I like much of their offense. Defensive line and quarterback, I think, essentially determines whether this team goes to the playoffs or has another down year like they did last year and it's a full-on rebuild. I do not like them early in the same way with A&M. I kind of loathe how this team is built and constructed early on. Like Jim Knowles, freshman quarterback, and I like Jim Knowles. I will die on the hill that his issues with Penn State were not because of him, and that Ohio State fans will never be able to process what he did for them because they genuinely, and I love Ohio State fans, but they genuinely believe that they don't lose any game. Like every loss was a fluke. It's similar with Alabama fans, Georgia fans, Michigan fans thought this way for a brief moment from 2023 to 2024, and then they lost enough where they were like hammered back down to earth. It's I love Jim Knowles, but I will admit that in inheriting a roster that just is not ready to be a top 5 defense or a top 5 roster nationally, it's not Ohio State's roster. It's not Georgia's, it's not Texas's. It is going to take time for him to implement his system and run what he wants to run, which is very specific. It's very strict. And I think an offense like Georgia Tech or Texas or most offenses they play early on can take advantage of that. And then you combine that with a true freshman quarterback and things could get dicey very quickly. I do trust their talent in the backfield and at receiver in Heupel's system to quickly bring the quarterback, whoever he is, up to speed. And I also think the defense, if it can stay healthy, will improve throughout the year. unlike Ohio State in 2022, which faced an underrated collection of offenses at the end of the year, Georgia's in 2022 was probably their best offense of the 21st century or something very close to that. Michigan's 2022 offense was historically dominant at running the football. I don't think any offense will be that good that Tennessee faces. So I don't think they'll be as exposed as they were in some of the first years of Jim Knowles at Penn State or Ohio State, even though they won't be a great or elite unit. I think they'll field the top 20 defense, not really anything else. For Oklahoma, now we're getting to some of the top-end teams in the SEC. I mean, LSU and I think Tennessee are top-end, but I do view Oklahoma as a top 10 power-rated team early, at 10th. With Isaiah Satenia returning, Trell Harris and Parker Livingston transferring in, Michael Fasusi returning, and John Mateer returning, and some key players like Kip Lewis or David Stone coming back, on defense, you got to give Venables benefit of the doubt defensively, and you have to think that in year two of Ben Arbuckle, with much better receivers and a better offensive line, that Mateer doesn't have to improve that much for his numbers to improve and for the floor of Oklahoma's offense to be risen by maybe a whole touchdown, like it was under Iowa when Lester got there, and then it was risen even further last year when they had a better quarterback in Gronowski and upgraded their, they were less of hand the ball off to Caleb Johnson and that's all we can do. They were much more diverse offensively. Oklahoma last year was a lot of deep shots to Satania, quarterback run with Mateer. I think they can be a lot more multiple than that this year, and that should be able to compensate for some of the drop-off they might face defensively. And I don't know how much of a drop-off they will face defensively. Like Eli Bowen, Cortland Gilroy, that should be a good corner group. And then you also have to look at, some of the guys they brought in, like Cole Sullivan at linebacker with Owen Heineke and Kip Lewis. That should be a great linebacker group. And you return Peyton Bowen at safety, Reggie Powers the third. I like the defense a lot for how much it lost. I don't like them as much up front, but I think there's a good chance that they'll improve in the backfield, especially after some of the lessons they learned last year where they lost to Texas and Ole Miss and nearly lost to Alabama because of their DB group. And that's also the only reason Alabama was able to score on them in the playoff last year. Very strong defensive front, a secondary that had a lot of questions about it, though. It honestly reminded me a lot of... It's going to be a Big Ten. It reminded me a lot of Georgia's 2022 defense, to make an SEC and not a Big Ten reference, which is what I'm more familiar with. Oklahoma's defense last year reminded me a lot of Georgia's in 2022, where if you could hold up against the front, you could absolutely destroy that secondary if you had good receivers and a good QB. And that is what Ole Miss was able to do. Texas was able to do that to a certain degree, even with their issues, because they had enough talent. And that was the same thing with Alabama when they didn't throw the pick six in the rematch. This should be a better team than last year. But Oklahoma won a lot of close games last year, and a lot of that was due to defense and special teams. They returned Tate Sandell at kicker, and I do love them in some spots. But a problem I do have with the Sooners here is how last year's schedule, when you slice it, was a bit easier than previously expected. So Texas wasn't as good as expected. South Carolina was worse. Auburn was worse. Michigan was worse. Ole Miss power ratings wise was probably a bit worse than expected, but in terms of record, they were just as good, if not better. Tennessee was a bit worse. Alabama was about the same or worse as expected. Missouri was banged up. LSU was much worse. They benefited a bit from a lot of chaos that happened to their opponents while they were able to rally around the flag, and Venables made some good moves. So Oklahoma succeeded at controlling their controllables, and things outside of their control pretty much went their way. With this schedule, UTEP at Michigan, New Mexico at Georgia, against Texas, they could be out of the playoff picture middle of October and still be a top 10 team. What could happen to Oklahoma this year is what happened to Notre Dame last year. A tough early part of the schedule knocks them out of the conversation, and they finish the year much better than several teams that make the playoffs. After their game against Texas, you got Kentucky at Mississippi State, South Carolina at Florida, Ole Miss, Texas A&M, and at Missouri. Tough November slate, tough September, early October slate. I think that bye is well timed, along with the Kentucky, Mississippi State, and South Carolina games. I like 9 wins for this team. I think that when you look at Michigan, Georgia, Texas, they're going to win one of those. And in their November slate, they're going to drop one of those games. And I picked Florida because I think Florida has the best roster of the November teams. And the Swamp is just a hellish place to play if they're up. I am picking them to upset Georgia. And this is interesting, so I kind of want to explain why I'm picking that. Texas, Georgia, and Michigan all have top 10 staffs at the worst. There's an argument that they all have top 5 staffs. They all have mobile QBs. Michigan's and Texas's in particular have a high upside. Georgia's QB probably has the highest floor. They all have questions defensively. For Texas, it's the safeties. For Georgia, it's the pass rush and defensive ends. It's basically the outside players. D ends and corners. The middle of the field, tackle, linebacker, safety, I think is pretty good. For Michigan, the question is their front. Corner and safety are pretty set, and D end, if Daly is healthy, should be set. All of them are away from Norman. Texas is neutral field in a rivalry. The reason I'm picking Oklahoma to beat Georgia is that to beat Venables, traditionally, from what I've seen in his time at Oklahoma, requires good QB and receiver connection. That's what it takes. It requires good offense. Like, not one-dimensional, oh, you only pass the ball, but being able to play complementary football and use the ground attack to punish that secondary. There are some defenses where you use the pass to open up the run and then you really, really punish that defense. With Oklahoma is a team where you keep them honest and you try to protect your quarterback and get him poised long enough to target Oklahoma's corners and safeties, who, again, while I think they'll be a little bit better than they were last year, should not be the strength of this defense and won't be. And Venables won't give them much help. Michigan is better at wide receiver than they were last year and will have one of the top offensive lines. They don't lose a whole lot from that unit, and Jim Harding's a wonderful coach there. Texas retooled their O-line in the portal. Their O-line already held up decently against Oklahoma's defense last year. I respect Kyle Flood as an O-line coach. They return Manning. They return Gooseby. They've upgraded a receiver. Michigan and Texas should have pretty impressive offenses. Texas, for a fact, I know that. Michigan, it's likely. I mean, J.J. Buchanan and Andrew Marsh. Michigan has at least 2 good receivers. Georgia has 1 good receiver. And they do not have the upside at quarterback that Texas and Michigan do, and they lost their best offensive lineman. So I love Georgia, and we'll actually get to Georgia in a few teams. But I think out of all of those 3, and I do think Oklahoma beats one of them, I think Georgia is the most likely. Because I think Oklahoma will best be able to hide their weaknesses against Georgia and exploit Georgia's weaknesses. I also believe that Georgia has enough holes where, much like last year, they're probably going to start the year off slowly and improve as the year goes on. Oklahoma's a strong team. They could very well reach the playoffs. I think they have a ceiling of going 11-1 this year. But they also have a low floor given their style of play and how the strength of their team last year, the defense, does lose quite a bit. Florida. You're probably shocked I have Florida this far ahead in my SEC predictions, but let me share the logic with you. So look at the schedule. Florida Atlantic, Campbell, at Auburn, Ole Miss, at Missouri, South Carolina, at Texas, bye. Georgia, neutral field, Oklahoma at home, at Kentucky, Vanderbilt, at Florida State. They play a non-con Power 4 team that's a dead program in FSU. So already their schedule has an advantage because they're playing a corpse in the P4 non-con and not a competent P4 non-con, either rival or scheduled game. That already gives them a scheduling edge. They play South Carolina at home. They get Kentucky on the road, Vanderbilt at home. Those are three teams that have some of the worst rosters in the SEC. They don't get Arkansas or Mississippi State, but they at least get one of those teams plus Kentucky. They avoid LSU. Their road slate outside of Texas is Kentucky, Florida State, Missouri, and Auburn. So a workable road schedule. They get Ole Miss at home. They get Oklahoma at home later in the year. Georgia's a neutral field game, and they've played Georgia close when their rosters are somewhat equivalent. So 2024 and 2025, they were fairly equivalent. Texas on the road is tough. It's probably a guaranteed loss in my mind. But look at the roster on top of that. So you got Jaden Baugh returning at running back, who's phenomenal. Eric Singleton Jr. transfers in at wide receiver. On top of that, you also have Vernell Brown III and Dallas Wilson, who return at wide receiver for the Gators. And Kenaje Harris returns at guard. Evan Pryor transfers in from Cincinnati, where he was a great running back. Aaron Philo at quarterback. They could have brought in other transfers, and Buster Faulkner chose to go with the guy that he's been with in spring, summer, and fall for several years now. Tony Livingston and Lakota Dupree is a great tight end group. And then at defensive end, they got Jaden Woods, Cameron James, and Emmanuel Badejo, or Badejo is probably how you say it. Hopefully in one of those attempts to pronounce his name, I got it right. My early look ahead for the fall tells me they probably have the deepest edge group in the SEC and the best edge group overall. They return Miles Graham at linebacker. Bryce Thornton, DJ Coleman, and Cam Dooley are their safeties. And Cormani McClain was, I would say okay, or at least good at corner for them last year. So they returned good. They retained good players. They brought in some key transfers. And Buster Faulkner and Brad White it's up there with Jason Beck and Jay Hill for a DC-OC pairing. Heck, it could be up there nationally with Arthur Smith, Matt Patricia, Jason Beck, and Jay Hill, Mike Shanahan, and Bryant Haynes. When you look at Glenn Schumann and Mike Bobo, like Buster Faulkner and Brad White is up there. I think Jim Knowles and Josh Heupel as the years go on. This is one of the best coordinator duos in football, with one of the best rosters in the SEC, with a schedule that I like a lot because their non-con opponent for the P4 is a corpse. So, boldly, as I discussed in a prior video, I actually have Florida going to the college football playoff. I think a 10-2 Florida automatically gets in. And really the only weakness that I can find with Florida is they're a bit thin at corner, and I don't know what they're going to do at tackle. But I also trust Phil Trotween, their offensive line coach and Florida alum who played under Urban Meyer. Running back, guard, center, receiver, defensive end, and safety is very strong. And one thing about Florida that I like too is when you look at their line of scrimmage play, the only team that I think will have better lines of scrimmage play than them, just doing a very quick overview here, would probably be Texas. And then maybe Georgia, but Georgia has questions at defensive end and also questions at tackle. And compared to those two teams, they have much better receivers than Georgia. Their receiver room could be the equivalent to Texas's if Wilson and Brown pan out and Singleton mesh as well. They have good tight ends, and they do have nice players in the defensive backfield as well. I mean, this is one of the best rosters in the SEC. A lot of people are looking at LSU as this freaky roster that can do well in the SEC, and they could. I kind of have my eyes set on Florida with this coordinator duo. This is a team where, and this is bold, if everything hits right, they can win the national title. Because their roster is about as freaky as it was last year, but they finally have good coaching. And their receiver room is going to be healthier than it was last year. So they're going to have areas where they're better. They're going to be better at running back, better at receiver. They could match last year's O-line talent with the coaching they do. They'll have a better defensive end group. They'll probably have a better safety group. And again, they'll have much better coaching. They'll have better development, better game planning, better game, like calling in-game, calling plays. They'll have a better leader. I know that some are all saying his team isn't where he wants to be, and that could be indicative of things being, a bit shaky. But Cignetti also said that about Indiana before Alabama, and they completely depanced and humiliated Alabama on live TV. So I'm just going with what I see here, and that is a Florida team that should only lose to Texas, really. I think matchups say they should actually beat Georgia neutral field. I just trust Kirby Smart to win that game. Texas, speaking of Texas, I think this is the most talented team in the SEC. The question is whether or not that translates directly to winning the SEC or winning it all. Will Muschamp replaces Pete Kwiatkowski, who was Texas's defensive coordinator for the first 5 years of the Sarkisian era? Texas, being preseason number 1 last year, failed to reach the college football playoff. I actually think that's the first time preseason number 1 has failed to reach the... Let me actually check that. Let me fact check that right now. I think that is the first time that preseason number 1 failed to reach the 4-team playoff. A lot of that had to do with Nick Saban, because his teams are, maybe Clemson some years would always be ranked high, and because they had good, like Florida State in 14 was preseason 1, they made it. Ohio State missed it, but that was also the 4-team era, and they barely missed it in 15. 16 Alabama made it. 17 Alabama made it, although they nearly missed. 18 Alabama made it. 19 Clemson made it. 20 Clemson made it. 21 Alabama made it. 22 Alabama barely missed. 23 Georgia missed. So that initial intuition was wrong, but they were the first preseason number 1 team to miss the 12-team playoff, and I don't think that will be common. I think that will be very rare for a preseason number 1 team to miss the college football playoff entirely. A lot of the highly ranked teams last year ended up missing that, but I think you had a lot of unique circumstances that played into that happening. With Manning returning at quarterback, Coleman transferring in at receiver to be paired with Ryan Wingo, and then you got Trevor Gooseby at offensive tackle, and he is paired with Melvin Sayini, Connor Robertson at center, Brandon Baker's shifting over to guard, Lawrence Seymour transferring in will be at guard. This could be the best offensive line in America. And then you pair that with Colin Simmons and Rasheem Biles, Bo Masco, Grayson Littleton, Cade Phillips, Ty Anthony Smith, and Ian Jeffrard and Hero Canoe on defense, and you have a loaded defensive roster. My question with Texas, and this is something I'll make a video on, my friend Baldfather Betts, a huge Texas fan, runs a wonderful betting channel. Just look it up, Baldfather Betts, you'll find it. Has a little over 100 subscribers now. It's a very small channel. Per capita subscribers, it might be the best channel on YouTube. It's very underrated. I should probably promote it more. The schedule's very tough, not just because it's Texas State, Ohio State, UTSA, at Tennessee, Oklahoma, Florida, Ole Miss, Mississippi State, at Missouri, at LSU, Arkansas, and at Texas A&M, but how will Muschamp's defense, with some questions at safety and a little bit of, I think, depth questions, matches up with tons of mobile QBs. So John Mateer, Trinidad Chambliss, Austin Simmons, Sam Levitt, KJ Jackson, Marcel Reed, and the amount of teams, too, like Ohio State, Tennessee, Oklahoma, Florida, Ole Miss, LSU, that should, or even Missouri, that should upgrade on the offensive line or be similar to what they were last year in a good way. So this, I think for Texas, what ultimately will determine whether their season is a success or a failure is actually going to be the offense. I think the defense is going to be what it is. It could regress, it could improve. Ultimately, I don't think it will be a 2024 level or really even close based on what I'm seeing. There will be areas which are more talented in the 2024 defense, but I just don't think they'll have like 8 defensive tackles they can rotate like they did that year. Or they're not going to be 3 or 4 deep at linebacker. They're not going to have the Thorpe Award winner at corner, although maybe I'll be wrong there. But they won't have that compared with a great safety room. And I do think Kwiatkowski is a better DC than Muschamp. I think Sark was willing to sacrifice that in exchange of getting some of what Georgia had with Muschamp. I think he wanted different energy, not necessarily like a better schematic mind, if that makes sense. We'll see if it pans out. It's going to come down to the offense. If Texas is the number 1 offense in the country, it won't matter if Muschamp's defense isn't generational. When I observe this schedule, really what I come away with thinking is that this team is going to go 11-1 or 12-0 with this schedule. Texas State, UTSA, Mississippi State, Arkansas too. Those are your 4 automatic wins. No matter what happens, Texas wins those games. And then Oklahoma, Florida, Ole Miss, Missouri, LSU, Tennessee. Those are really games where I think Texas is very likely to win. And then I would go with A&M and Ohio State and maybe Oklahoma if Mateer's performance last year had more to do with injuries than I think. Those games could be tricky. I think especially the Ohio State game, given how early it is. Ohio State does lose a lot, sure, and Texas returns more and did a much better job in the portal than Ohio State did, but Ohio State will have a coaching advantage. And Ohio State, as much as I don't think they have the ceiling of Texas and their average player starting-wise could even be significantly worse, I do think they have a higher floor at a lot of positions, and that early on with the coaching edge could give you a 2024 Georgia versus 2024 Texas situation where the inferior team actually wins due to schematic and coaching edges and just some general matchups. So I'm curious to see how that game goes. As of right now, I think Texas wins every game in the regular season. I might change that, but if I do, I'll just have them dropping a game. Their only weakness really is safety. Everywhere else is a strength. It doesn't mean they're the best in America at every other position, but they'll be competing for the best in America at almost every other position except for safety. I forgot to mention Hollywood Smothers and Raleek Brown. That could be the best running back duo in America. Michael Masunis is a great tight end pickup. I am picking them to lose the SEC championship game to Georgia because I trust Georgia's coaching. For Georgia, I'm really concerned about their roster. And this is probably a good way to close off the SEC predictions, not just because I'm picking Georgia to win the SEC, but also because I think Georgia's a microcosm of what's going on in the SEC. Georgia and their trajectory is like a mini universe of the SEC's current trajectory, where the SEC's problems relate to a lot of things that are actually outside of their control, in the same way that a lot of their successes related to things that were outside of their control. I speak of it this way because the SEC, like any large organization, is a part of a pretty big group of people. And when you have a pretty big group of people, there's more variance. And when there's more variance, having a specific outcome is a result of a lot of variables that are outside of one's control. I'm not taking away the individual agency of players in the SEC or coaches. In fact, I think that Georgia has done the best job they possibly can of maximizing their individual agency. Kirby Smart has had closer to 2, 3, or even 4 lost teams over the past 2 years than undefeated or national title caliber teams. And yet he's gotten both to the playoff. They've both won the SEC. They've had some very impressive wins, specifically over Texas. They've also had some head-scratching losses. But when you take away the logo and you realize what Georgia's roster is, Their loss to Ole Miss last year actually isn't unexpected at all. Their loss to Alabama earlier in the year isn't unexpected. Their loss to Notre Dame, especially given the backup quarterback situation, should have been expected in 2024. Their loss to Ole Miss and Alabama also shouldn't be unexpected when looking at that 2024 campaign. Ever since their national title in 2022, and I've fallen guilty to this, we've all overrated Georgia a little bit because of what they did in those 2 years and because of their recruiting talent. The reality is that Georgia has not had a great defense since 2022. 2023, 4, and 5 all had at times good defenses. Other times they had some pretty mediocre performances, and it was really the offenses those years that did a lot for Georgia. Even in 2024, when Beck was on, him and whatever they could muster up at receiver, like, for example, against Georgia Tech, that comeback. And then at times the defense in 24 when they faced Texas or Notre Dame, they stepped up to the plate. But it's been a lot of inconsistency for Georgia since that most recent national title. And a lot of people say that's on Kirby Smart. And maybe it is, but I also don't really think it is, if I'm being honest. I mean, think of, people are giving Ryan Day heat because with 5 first-round picks, Reese, Styles, Downs, McDonald, and Tate, they didn't win it all last year. And really, you factor in Jeremiah Smith, that's 6. If you want to give Julian Sain benefit of the doubt, and I'm going to, 7. Bo Jackson won't be a first-rounder because he's a running back, but he could be the best running back of his class. They had several players that now or in the future are the best of their class, and they didn't win it all. They're, Day's getting a lot of heat for that. And a part of me gets that, in the same way that I get people giving Kirby Smart heat for not, winning it all recently. But at the same time, that's different. Some of this is on Smart, but some of it's also on the fact that, look, in the NIL era, Georgia would probably have like a middle third NIL collective in the Big Ten. They do not have, and I can speak on this pretty confidently, Ohio State, Michigan, Oregon, honestly, probably Indiana, too. Just have more money than they do in the Big Ten. USC, how did I even forget to mention them? USC has more money than they do in the Big Ten. Penn State even might. They do not have the booster and donor base to maintain the nation's number 1 roster. It's why even though right now they're probably in the best state for high school football, they're not finishing with number 1 classes or even number 2 or number 3 classes. They finished with a class that was outside the top 5 for the first time, I think, ever under Kirby Smart. A lot of that is financial, I think, and the way that Georgia is doing things. You also, another tell for this is how they will lose players to the NFL who are not even guaranteed to be day 1 players, and they'll just lose them to the NFL. Ohio State, meanwhile, if you are a day 2 player with eligibility, like Kenyatta Jackson Jr., you always come back. You never leave. Like Austin Sierreveld could have gotten drafted probably on day 3. He didn't leave. He came back. So there is this part of Georgia where, I don't think people understand how good of coaches Ryan Day and Kirby Smart are. For Ryan Day to be able to have a roster as loaded as they did last year in the portal era after they lost that much and both their coordinators, that's nuts. That's insanely impressive. For Kirby Smart to have nearly as many wins as Ryan Day over the past 2 years, despite not even having as close to the roster that Day has had, that is also very impressive. I still think that Kirby Smart by a mile is the best head coach in this conference. And Mike Bobo, I also believe, is the best offensive coordinator in this conference. And I also believe Mike Bobo is the best offensive coordinator in this conference. Peering ahead to close out this SEC predictions video, Georgia's schedule is very easy. This is the easiest schedule, I think, in the SEC, or very close to it. Tennessee State, Western Kentucky, at Arkansas, Oklahoma, Vanderbilt, at Alabama, Auburn, Florida, at Ole Miss, Missouri, at South Carolina, Georgia Tech. They avoid Texas and LSU, and they get Oklahoma at home, and yes, they do get Alabama on the road, but Alabama's entering a rebuild phase. You'd rather play them in October or September than you would in November. I have Georgia for now, yet again winning the SEC, even though I think Texas really has a far better roster than they do. I would peg Georgia's roster as a fringe top 10 roster right now when factoring in development and on-field performance. I think that there's a lot of places right now where talent carried certain teams. I think that last year's Ohio State offense is a perfect example of what happens if they don't have Smith or Tate. That offense would be radically different than it ended up being. And you saw that in big games where against Texas, Indiana, and Miami, they averaged 10 points per game. Like, that really wasn't a good offense. It was just good against the weak because they could abuse them with talent. Georgia, I think, is the case of punching above their hypothetical weight class, where on paper, and maybe you'll disagree with me, that's fine. On paper, they're this uber talented team, just like Ohio State and Oregon are, and for some years Texas. But in actuality, for most of the time, those three, and especially Ohio State, have actually been pretty well ahead of them when you look in, like, at talent in reality, where maybe Georgia NFL talent-wise is matching them or close, but when you look at the college play, those three are further ahead. The reason Georgia is who they are and why they keep winning, I think, is a lot to do with Kirby Smart. So with that combined with a easy schedule, and look, they should be strong at D tackle and linebacker. I would expect their defense to be better this year than it was last year. They're strong at running back. I love Gunnar Stockton as a quarterback, and he's a top 5 quarterback entering this fall. I do think they'll win 11 regular season games. Ceiling of 12-0, floor of 9-3 with that schedule. Most likely is 11-1. I have them dropping a game to Oklahoma. I just don't think that Georgia without receivers is going to have without receivers and without pass rush, that's not going to be fun against Oklahoma returning their O-line, having great It's just, I think it's a horrific matchup for Georgia. Georgia's weaknesses play exactly into what Oklahoma wants to do and can do. But outside of that, I think they're going to pretty much run the table with this schedule. And then I have them beating Texas in the SEC title game, mostly due to coaching, but we'll see. We'll see if that changes again. These are very early predictions. Thank you for sitting through this incredibly long video. Just love going deep in on these teams and giving my full analysis on them. Absolutely love that. Make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Now let's move on to greener pastures. Let's move on to that now. I'm going to take a brief water break because that was a very long segment. So we're going to take a water break. We'll be right back to discuss the Big Ten schedule and then get into some of the early previews for some of these other teams, and then talk about some other topics before we ultimately get on out of here. We will see you guys in probably 5 minutes. Just sit back and relax. And we're back. Thank you all for waiting around and for your patience. Really appreciate it. Okay, so in looking at the Big Ten schedule, this is what I want to do next. Let me just find things. Okay, here we go. There we go. So let's talk about the Big Ten schedule and do a little bit of a deep dive into it. How I want to do this is I'm going to, just thinking through how to do this. Here's how I want to approach looking at the Big Ten schedules. I am going to grade every Big Ten schedule on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being the easiest, 10 being the hardest. And what I mean by easiest and hardest is in all of college football. So in the Big Ten, you're not going to see any 1s, 2s, or 3s, or maybe even 4s. You're going to see a lot of 10s, 8s, 9s, 7s, and some 5s, because the Big Ten and the SEC are the top 2 conferences. I think the Big Ten will be the best conference in 2026. Therefore, they're going to disproportionately have the harder schedules in college football. I'm going to rank them on a scale of 1 to 10 and just briefly talk through them, and we'll save some of the tougher schedules for last. Or is that how it goes? Oh yeah, no, that's not how it goes. We're going to go through the schedules in alphabetical order. We're going to go through all 18 Big Ten schedules in alphabetical order and give every schedule a 1 to 10 ranking of toughness, or maybe we should say rating of toughness. Since the 1 to 10 rating is meant to be used for all college football schedules in the FBS, you're not going to see any 1s or 2s or 3s or even 4s in the Big Ten, because they're not playing in the MAC or the American or the Mountain West. At worst, you're probably going to see a 5 or a 6, a lot of 8s, 9s, 10s, and some 7s as well. But this should be a fun exercise to see who has the toughest schedules, and just talking about them with maybe a little bit of context about how good each team is. But this is meant to be mostly a schedule deep dive and only caring about the schedules, not caring about much else. So the first thing I want to show all of you is not any specific schedule. It's just very quickly, for a few seconds, a image of all Big Ten football schedules for this fall. Every single 2026 Big Ten schedule is here, is displayed on the screen. So just take a look at that. What jumped out to me when this schedule series released over a month ago at this point, what really jumped out to me is how many Big Ten teams are playing Notre Dame, Michigan State, Penn State, and Wisconsin. It also jumped out to me that Ohio State, Oregon, Indiana, Michigan, USC, who are really viewed as the unanimous preseason top 5 in the Big Ten, maybe some would even flirt with putting Washington there. Even if you include Washington, your top 6 in the Big Ten, top 5, top 4, whatever, all of your presumed top 6 teams have gauntlets of schedules. All of them do. They all have very, very tough schedules. So it's interesting, in my opinion, because that means there's going to be a lot of opportunity for chaos against the top teams, and there's going to be opportunities for inferior teams, worse staffs, worse rosters, to take that next step or gain some momentum with some of the easier schedules they have. The first schedule I want to discuss, going in alphabetical order, is Illinois. Illinois' schedule is as follows. UAB September 5th, Duke September 12th, Southern Illinois September 19th. They open up Big Ten Conference play traveling to Ohio State September 26th, host Purdue October 3rd, play at Michigan State October 10th. They get a bye October 17th, and then they host Oregon October 24th, play at Maryland October 31st. Nebraska's at home November 7th. They play UCLA on the road November 14th. Host Iowa November 21st and play at rival Northwestern November 28th. I gave this an 8 out of 10 on the difficulty scale. It's one of the tougher schedules in college football, but it is not a 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 10, because even though they play both Oregon and Ohio State, they get one at home. Duke is going to go in under a bit of a rebuild, I think, in losing Darian Mensah and Cooper Barcade. And Maryland, Purdue, Northwestern, Nebraska, UCLA, Michigan State, these are teams that are at best going to be flirting with the top 25. So while they do get Oregon and Ohio State, who will probably be the preseason favorites for the Big Ten, they don't get a lot of teams in that middle tier outside of maybe Iowa, who they get at home. Looking ahead to the next team, being Indiana. Indiana went 16-0. They were the national champions. They open up against North Texas September 5th, Howard September 12th, Western Kentucky September 19th, Northwestern September 26th. Their first road game is at Rutgers October 3rd, so they never leave their own state in the month of September. They also play at Nebraska October 10th before hosting Ohio State in the 17th of October, and play Michigan on the road October 24th. They and Oregon, we'll get to Oregon later, play Michigan and Ohio State back-to-back, which I think is pretty fascinating. They also host Minnesota October 31st before getting a bye on November 7th. November 14th, they host USC. Almost said UCLA there. They play at Washington November 21st and host Purdue November 28th. For Indiana, what I think is interesting about this schedule is how easy it starts off, but then you get Nebraska, Ohio State, Michigan, Minnesota, 2 home games, 2 road games. That is a very tough October slate. If you include Rutgers, it still is. And then USC and Washington back-to-back is tough. So this is a schedule that is meant to build Indiana up at the start, and then if they get things right, they'll be able to succeed in spite of a very tough October and November slate. I also give this an 8 out of 10 because they don't have to play themselves, and they avoid Oregon and get Ohio State at home. Also, I think their bye is nicely timed and their non-conference schedule is very easy. Iowa has a 6 out of 10 difficulty, and I lead with that because it's a change, not just from the previous 2 schedules you talked about, which are 8s from Illinois and Indiana. It is a change from what Iowa has faced last year under Kirk Ferentz, where they played, Indiana, USC, Penn State, Oregon, all of whom were top 25 power-rated teams. That was a tough schedule last year. And Iowa State, before things kind of unraveled, was respectable as well. Nebraska, if they had Raiola, would have been a respectable opponent too. That was a very tough schedule that Iowa faced. And then the year before that, they had some tricky road games. They were a bit of an inconsistent team. They had to play Ohio State on the road, which playing that Ohio State team on the road is just a bear of a task. And Nebraska at the end of the year wasn't banged up. They were actually fairly respectable that season. This year, Iowa plays Northern Illinois, Iowa State, Northern Iowa, at Michigan. That's their September slate. They play Ohio State October 3rd, at Washington October 10th. They get a bye at Minnesota October 24th, Wisconsin October 31st, at Northwestern November 7th, Purdue November 14th, at Illinois November 21st, and then hosting Nebraska on Black Friday November 27th. This is a 6. And it is a 6 because Iowa State will be rebuilding. Their non-conference slate is garbage. They have to play Michigan and Ohio State back-to-back, along with Indiana and Oregon. I did forget Iowa had to play them back-to-back too. But they get Ohio State at home. Michigan and Washington are tough road games. But Minnesota, Wisconsin, basically every team they play after their bye definitively has an inferior roster to them. So it is one of the easier schedules in the Big Ten. For Maryland, Maryland has a 6 out of 10 schedule as well. I am not optimistic about Mike Locksley, but again, we're talking about the schedule here and maybe some of the teams they're facing, not the specific team themselves. For Maryland, they open up with Hampton, play at UConn September 12th, host Virginia Tech September 19th. It's a actually fairly tough non-conference schedule. Their conference schedule is hosting UCLA September 26th, playing at Nebraska and at Ohio State back-to-back on October 3rd and 10th. They host Rutgers October 17th before entering their bye. And after their bye, they play Illinois at Purdue, Wisconsin at USC, and Penn State, alternating home and road games from October 31st to November 28th. They avoid Indiana. They avoid Oregon. they avoid Washington, and they avoid Michigan. So they avoid a lot of those teams in the upper echelon of the Big Ten. But they still, road game against a UConn team who's been good in the past. Virginia Tech at home is going to have probably some better players than they do. At Nebraska's not going to be easy. At USC and at Ohio State are going to be chores. Penn State will still have a better roster than them. It is a very workable schedule and one of the easier schedules in the Big Ten. The non-conference slate and having to play Ohio State and USC on the road just stopped me from labeling it as the easiest schedule in the conference. Moving on to Michigan. Michigan is the first 10 schedule that we'll be discussing. So why is it a 10? Well, they play Western Michigan September 5th, Oklahoma September 12th, and UTEP September 19th. That's their non-conference slate. Just by playing Oklahoma, that's one of the tougher non-conference slates in America. After that, this is the rest of their schedule. Iowa at home, Minnesota on the road, bye, Penn State, Indiana, Rutgers on the road, Michigan State, at Oregon, UCLA, at Ohio State. They have to play Indiana, Oregon, and Ohio State, who are, in my mind, at least 3 of the top 5 teams, if not maybe the top 3 teams, maybe 3 of the top 4. And I think that Penn State, Iowa, Oklahoma will be other teams that will be top 25, with Iowa and Oklahoma flirting in the top 10. And I'm high on UCLA too, and Minnesota returns a lot of production. This is one of the toughest schedules in college football. I do not think it's the toughest in the Big Ten. We'll get to that team later. You can probably guess who that is if you've looked at the schedule. But Michigan is one of the toughest. And my goodness, I mean, if they go 9-3, they should definitely be in the playoffs if they go 9-3. If they go 10-2, you might want to give Kyle Whittingham Coach of the Year award, given the disaster that Sharon Moore just put Michigan in. Michigan State, the arch rival of the Michigan Wolverines, the in-state rival, they have a schedule that is not as tough as Michigan's. It might be one of the toughest in America if you assess a schedule's difficulty based on the power rating of a team playing it. So Michigan State plays Toledo and Eastern Michigan September 5th and 12th. Then have to play at Notre Dame September 19th, host Nebraska on the 26th of September. Their October slate, Wisconsin on the 3rd on the road, Illinois at home on the 10th, Northwestern at home on the 17th, and at UCLA October 24th. After the bye, this is a murderer's row of 3 games. At Michigan, Washington, Oregon, close the year with a road game at Rutgers. If Michigan State doesn't quit by the end of the year, that Rutgers game could be a pivotal game to determine whether or not they go bowling or get a 5th win or close out the year with some momentum. It is an 8 out of 10 because Notre Dame, Michigan, Washington, and Oregon suck, but Nebraska, Wisconsin, Illinois, Northwestern, UCLA, Rutgers, and the 2 MAC teams they play are very winnable games, especially when you consider they get Washington and Oregon at home, and travel is going to hurt both of those teams there. They're both look-ahead spots. And then Nebraska, Illinois, and Northwestern, I think, could be vulnerable as Michigan State and Pat Fitzgerald in year 1 host those teams. Minnesota, I think the last of the M team we're talking about. Can't think of that off the top of my head. I'm too focused on looking at all these nice colors and teams and the schedules. Minnesota has a 7 out of 10 difficulty. Eastern Illinois, Mississippi State, Akron, and at Washington is their September slate. On October 3rd, they host Michigan for the Battle of the Little Brown Jug. They play at Purdue October 10th. Off the bye, they play Iowa, at Indiana, UCLA, at Penn State, Northwestern, and at Wisconsin. They avoid Ohio State and Oregon, also avoid USC. Now, Iowa, Indiana, Michigan, and Washington are very, very, very tough. But being able to play Purdue, like that's a pretty good, sigh of relief. You get Northwestern and UCLA, who I think are good teams, but you get them at home. And I don't think Wisconsin has a better roster than you. Same with Mississippi State. So it is a tough schedule, yes, but I think it is easier than a lot of the schedules we talked about so far and we'll talk about. It is a middle of the road, if not maybe slightly below average Big Ten schedule. Nebraska. This is our first 9 out of 10 schedule that we're going to discuss. Non-conference games aside, they're very easy. They canceled the series against Tennessee, and at the time I hated that. I still do. But if they played Tennessee at home or on the road this year, they could be staring down the barrel of 4-8 or 5-7. I mean, this schedule is the toughest Nebraska's played since 2021, where they played Michigan State, Ohio State, Michigan, and Oklahoma, all of whom finished with 11 wins or more. They played 4 of those teams. On top of that, they played a Wisconsin team that was unanimously top 15 in power ratings that year. Minnesota was pretty good. They had to play Iowa, who won 10 games. I don't know if this schedule's that tough, but I think it's close. It helps that they don't have to play Oklahoma in the non-con. But it's close to that schedule. Ohio, Bowling Green, North Dakota, at Michigan State, Maryland, Indiana, at Oregon. Off the bye, Washington, at Illinois, Rutgers, Ohio State, and Iowa. I'd confidently say, due to the non-con, it's not as tough as that 2021 schedule, but I also don't know if this Nebraska team is more talented than that 2021 team. I don't know if they'll be power rated as highly either. So, relatively, it might be as tough as that schedule. If Matt Rule can win 8 games with this schedule, Nebraska should give him a lifetime contract. And I'm not kidding you when I say that. To lose Raiola and then go out and win 8 games with this schedule, you should just like slap the lifetime contract on his table instantly with how tough that is. Northwestern, this is the toughest schedule we've talked about so far. Still don't think it's the toughest, but it's very close. If you are using relative strength of schedule rankings, this probably is the toughest schedule in college football. Giving them a bye in week 2 is so criminal. And their non-conference slate consisting of South Dakota State and Colorado, and then Ball State in the middle of the year is just, it's so evil and diabolical. But of course they're going to do it to Northwestern because they're Northwestern. After South Dakota State on September 5th, they play Colorado on the 19th, at Indiana the 26th. In October, they play Penn State, Ball State, at Michigan State, and Rutgers, and also Oregon on the road. And then in their November slate, they play Iowa, at Ohio State, at Minnesota, and Illinois. They close out the year against Illinois, November 28th. Very tough schedule. You got to play Indiana, Oregon, and Ohio State all on the road. Minnesota and Michigan State are your other road opponents. And Colorado, Penn State, Rutgers, Iowa, and Illinois are your like P4 home games. You're playing 10 P4 teams. You're possibly playing, again, 3 of the top 5, 4, even possibly the 3 best teams in America, all on the road. Iowa's going to be really good. Penn State's going to be good. Colorado could have a bounce back year. It's going to be a huge test for David Braun facing this schedule. We now are talking about the toughest schedule in America. Let's go. That's Ohio State. Ohio State has a 2024 Georgia level schedule where you have a tough non-con and you got the murder's row of your conference's schedule. You didn't get screwed like Northwestern with the bye, but let me read this schedule to you all. This would be an 11 out of 10 if we went above the 10 scale. So Ball State at home September 5th, nice warm-up game. Then at Texas September 12th, Kent State September 19th, Illinois September 26th, at Iowa October 3rd, Maryland October 10th, at Indiana October 17th, off the bye at USC October 31st, Oregon November 7th, Northwestern November 14th, at Nebraska November 21st, and hosting Michigan November 28th. This is no doubt Ohio State's toughest relative strength of schedule, possibly in their history. It's their toughest relative strength of schedule in the 21st century for sure. By relative, I mean you take, you adjust the strength of schedule for the power rating of the team playing it. So Ohio State almost always has an easy relative strength of schedule because they're always one of the most talented teams, or the most talented team even in some years. This is Ohio State's toughest schedule in general in the 21st century, I think. And add on top of that the portal and the portal exodus they had, and the fact that, I don't know how you can say that like this round of Alabama transfers is as good as the ones they had in 2024 without being intellectually dishonest. This is probably Ohio State's least talented team since 2021, and on paper recruiting it probably would be their least talented team since before the playoff era. So that combined with this schedule makes it their toughest relative strength of schedule in a minute. And I do think it's the toughest schedule in college football. Just knowing Ryan Day, they're probably going to win 9, 10, or 11 games with this schedule and be in the playoffs anyway. So it's not it's not a talking point of, oh, like maybe they'll implode. It's a talking point of this is crazy. This is insane. I mean, I would hate making a Georgia prediction video with this or the Northwestern schedule because I'd have to tell Georgia viewers I'd be picking them to lose 3 or 4 games with their roster. Oregon, they have a difficult schedule. It's not quite like Ohio State's or Northwestern's. It's an 8. You could argue it should be a 9 with the Oklahoma State non-con game if you're high on Oklahoma State. They play Boise State, Oklahoma State on the road, Portland State at home, and at USC in their September slate before getting a bye. After the bye, they play UCLA, Nebraska, at Illinois, Northwestern, at Ohio State, Michigan, at Michigan State, and Washington. Only reason I did not give it a 10 is because, so Michigan plays Ohio State, Oregon, Indiana. Northwestern plays the same teams. Ohio State substitutes themselves for Texas on the road. Oregon doesn't play themselves. They have to play Ohio State on the road. They get Michigan at home, and Michigan has to travel their way, and they avoid Indiana. So I just don't think Oregon's playing the exact same amount of top-tier caliber teams. It is a tough schedule, but I think it might be a little bit easier than some realize when you factor in relative strength of schedule, because I think Oregon's roster is just that good. But that's a point for another video. We're now probably approaching the easiest schedule, but there's one more at the end. And I actually forget which one I tabbed as the easiest. Penn State's, it's either them or a team that starts with a W. You probably know who they are, the Badgers, the Wisconsin Badgers. It's one of those two is the easiest schedule in the Big Ten. I gave Penn State a 4 out of 10. Trash non-conference schedule, Marshall at Temple, Buffalo. They host Wisconsin to open up Big Ten play September 26th. Play at Northwestern, USC, and then at Michigan, October 3rd, 10th, and 17th. I expect USC to probably be the whiteout game. Off the bye, it's Purdue, at Washington, Minnesota, Rutgers again in a back-to-back home series, and then at Maryland to close out the year. Penn State could be a worse power-rated team than last year, and if they win close games, they could go 10-2 or 11-1 and be in the playoffs. So this is kind of the opposite of Ohio State's schedule, where with Ohio State, it's like the schedule and losses are fun. What matters is the power rating and if the schedule like beats that team down. For Penn State, the record isn't really going to matter. Or for Penn State, the power rating isn't going to matter much with this schedule. It's going to determine what their record looks like, if that makes sense. It's kind of the opposite, where with Ohio State's schedule or even Michigan's and Northwestern's, you're not looking at the record as much as you are the on-field performance and the power rating. And if they're high enough in those areas, they'll win despite having an absolutely insane schedule. They may not win 11 games, Northwestern certainly not. They may not even win 10. But with how tough their schedule is, like if Michigan goes 9-3 or Ohio State goes 9-3, those teams should still be a lock for the playoffs with those schedules, and they'll probably be top 10 teams with 9-3 records. With Penn State, you don't really care about the power ratings because it's year one of a long rebuild and the roster was gutted, and you have an easy schedule. So whether you're the 10th best team in metrics or you're the 30th best, what do you do with a very easy schedule? Regardless of that ranking, you should still win a ton of games and compete for the playoffs. Purdue has an 8 out of 10 schedule. I'm just going to read it really quickly because Purdue, and if you're a Purdue fan watching this, I'm sorry to say this, but just with how bad the team has been recently and how they just change their roster year over year over year and don't have a lot of money to fund the program, they're not really interesting to talk about. But Indiana State, Wake Forest, at UCLA, Notre Dame, at Illinois, Minnesota, Washington, at Penn State, Maryland, at Iowa, Wisconsin, and at Indiana. If Indiana wasn't a permanent rivalry, this would be one of the easier Big Ten conference schedules. But because they have to play Indiana every year and they also have to play Notre Dame in the non-con, that makes this schedule pretty tough. If Barry Odom can get this team to a bowl game, that would be Coach of the Year material. The one fortunate thing they have is probably getting Washington before the bye at home and then being able to play Maryland and Wisconsin later in the year when maybe their teams have quit by then and they could pick up some wins there. Rutgers. The Rutgers Scarlet Knights. 8 out of 10. You're going to see a lot of 8 out of 10s here. UMass at Boston College, and UMass and Boston College are both played on weekdays, Thursday, September 3rd and Friday, September 11th. They then have 3 home games in a row, USC, Howard, and Indiana off the bye. They play at Maryland, at Northwestern, Michigan, at Nebraska, or at Wisconsin, Nebraska, at Penn State, and Michigan State. They do avoid Oregon and Ohio State, but Nebraska, Penn State, Northwestern, USC, like potentially one of Michigan State, Wisconsin, like Maryland. There's a lot of like middle of the road teams in there, and a lot of them are on the road, Wisconsin and Maryland especially. So it's not an easy schedule at all. And Rutgers quietly had a really good offense last year. I'm curious to see what changes, because they made a lot of changes to their identity and to their staff and roster this year. Curious to see how they handle the schedule. The Boston College game should be a huge test for them. We're nearing the end, but we have UCLA here. At California, San Diego State, Purdue, at Maryland. That's their September slate. After the bye, it's at Oregon. They got 3 home games in a row, Wisconsin, Michigan State, and Nevada. Then at Minnesota, Illinois, at Michigan, which is an interesting spot because traveling out east that late in the year would probably be pretty painful for UCLA. But it's also the week before the Michigan-Ohio State game. And I think Michigan-Ohio State's going to be taken more seriously by those parties than USC-UCLA will. So that could actually play to UCLA's advantage to like play them before they make that trip to Ohio State, as they're going to be very focused on that. And then they play USC at home to close out the year. I gave this a 7 out of 10. The fact that one of their top 4 opponents is California on the road means it is going to be one of the easier Big Ten schedules. I'm very high on UCLA this year from a record perspective because, look, Oregon on the road, you'd want that game to be on the road because it's likely going to be an auto loss. You'd probably want Michigan to be on the road for a similar, although not as extreme, reason. All your home games, except for USC, you will be favored or the better team, most likely, especially when factoring in travel. And Minnesota and Maryland and Cal are shaky enough where you could steal road wins there. You could. Doesn't mean you will. So I love UCLA to take advantage of the schedule. If they don't, this is probably going to be one of the easier schedules Chesney gets, so they need to hit the ground running in year one. USC, they're going to be playing in week 0, so they'll get 2 byes. It's a pretty big advantage for them. They canceled their series with Notre Dame. Mutual decision that I hate, but I get it in the current era of football. They're going to beat whoever they play in week 0. They also play Fresno State, Louisiana, open up Big Ten Conference play traveling to Rutgers September 19th. They host Oregon and Washington back-to-back and then play at Penn State on October 10th. That's going to be a pretty tricky, even 4-game slate. 2 trips well out east, and Oregon and Washington at home back-to-back. Off the bye, they travel to Wisconsin and host Ohio State. And then off their second bye, they play at Indiana, then host Maryland, play at UCLA. I gave them a 9 out of 10, and after looking at this, I'm honestly going to give them a 10. So ignore the 9, just like live change, they have a 10. They got to play Ohio State, Oregon, and Indiana. And yes, they get Maryland and Wisconsin and an easy non-conference slate in Rutgers. But they have to travel to Wisconsin and Rutgers on top of traveling to Penn State and traveling to Indiana. They got to travel to UCLA. they do have 5 road Big Ten games, and 4 of them are in different time zones with thousands of miles of travel, and they have to play Oregon and Ohio State. This is USC's toughest schedule in the Riley era, maybe outside of their 2023 schedule in the Pac-12. And this one, I think, well, I don't know. That'd be an interesting video to talk about with these teams with tough schedules. Is this like the toughest schedule they've had in the 21st century in the playoff era? That would be an interesting video. But USC's schedule is, if USC goes 8-4, fans would be pissed, but it would probably be a better season than what they had last year. Washington, second to last team, then we got Wisconsin, and then it's it. Washington's schedule I gave an 8 out of 10 because they have to play Indiana and Oregon, let alone back-to-back, and they also have games against USC and Iowa. But their whole schedule is workable, especially with the talent they have. Washington State, Utah State, Eastern Washington, and Minnesota is their September slate. That's very easy, I think. In October, they play at USC, Iowa, at Purdue. They get a bye on October 24th before traveling to Nebraska on the 31st. And their November slate is Penn State at home, Michigan State on the road, Indiana at home, and Oregon on the road. Washington needs to have a faster start than anyone else in this conference, because back-to-back Indiana and Oregon, I view those as the 2 best teams in football, and Oregon's a rivalry game. So if they, and maybe this is bold, if they enter those 2 games 9-1, they're missing the playoffs because they're not beating those 2. Those are close to 2 guaranteed losses. So if they want to reach the playoffs, I think they have to kind of start out 10-0. And they could. There's no one on the schedule that's remotely comparable to Oregon or Indiana that Washington plays besides them. Now we're looking at, okay, I agree with my analysis that I made when making these slides and looking at these schedules. Yeah, Wisconsin has, I think, the second toughest schedule in the Big Ten. It's only tougher than Penn State's because they got to play Notre Dame. And Notre Dame would be the best team on Penn State's schedule. They also have to play Iowa, and Iowa, I think, is a comparable team to Michigan. A little bit worse, but comparable. They have to play USC, much like Penn State does. And they have to play UCLA on the road, which is going to be a tricky travel spot. So I do think Wisconsin has one of the easier schedules in the Big Ten. It's not as easy as Penn State. Notre Dame in a neutral field, Western Illinois, Eastern Michigan, at Penn State, Michigan State. Then off the bye at UCLA, USC, Iowa on the road, Rutgers at home, Maryland and Purdue are back-to-back road games, and then Minnesota at home. This is a year where if Luke Fickell is a good coach, they're going bowling. I think they did enough in the portal and retaining guys where, with how easy the schedule is, if the locker room truly follows him and if he is truly a good coach, they are going to win 7 or 8 games. Like they have to with this schedule. It is so unbelievably easy. And they did not have quite the same roster turnover that Penn State did. It was close, but not quite as extreme. Those are my rankings of the 2026 Big Ten schedules. Let me know what you think about these schedules and if I assessed their difficulty properly down in the comments section below. Now we can get on to some previews, some in-depth previews. Yeah, that took 30 minutes there, which I think is pretty worth it for a Big Ten schedule deep dive. Where are we in regards to time? This is going to be like another 4.5 hour stream, which I don't like those, but that's what happens. That is exactly what happens. Oh, wow. Excuse me. Yeah. All right. I am going to take a quick break to get some more water, and then we'll be back and we'll finish out the stream talking about Texas, Alabama, Georgia, and Michigan and my way too early predictions for them. Hey guys, I think I'm a bit like worn out from the jet lag and from the SEC prediction segment. So these in-depth early predictions I will discuss on Friday. We're going to cut the stream short today, or technically end on the time that I planned it to end, which was at 3. Yeah, went a little bit longer again. But this should be enough. Talking about the Big Ten schedules for every team, talking about every SEC team in a huge deep dive. We'll be back at you Friday at noon, as always, with a lot more shorter topics for specific teams. Love you guys very much. Thank you for being patient. Glad to be back for the rest of the year with no more breaks. Have a fantastic day.